A shadow war on the edge of a superpower standoff. In the dense web of Middle Eastern geopolitics, no rivalry burns quite as cold, nor smolders as dangerously, as the one between Israel and Iran. It is not merely a clash of nations, but a battle of worldviews: Zionism against Islamic Republic ideology, Western alliance against resistance axis, deterrence doctrine against existential defiance. Theirs is a conflict shaped not by direct armies meeting in the field, but by spies in the night, hackers in the ether, shadow wars waged in distant deserts, and diplomacy laced with the constant threat of escalation. What makes the Israel-Iran conflict particularly volatile is not simply the animosity, but the reach and influence both states project far beyond their borders. Iran, as the self-declared leader of the axis of resistance, funds and arms militant proxies across the region. From Lebanon's Hezbollah to Yemen's Houthis and militias in Iraq and Syria. Israel, in turn, leverages its technological prowess, its powerful Western allies, chief among them the United States, and its doctrine of preemptive defense to keep Iranian advances at bay. The two nations were once allies, unlikely, pragmatic partners during the Cold War era, tied by oil, arms, and strategic calculation. But the 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran transformed that tenuous friendship into a deep ideological and geopolitical enmity. In the decades since, they have never fought a direct war, yet they have shed each other's blood through assassinations, cyber attacks, and missile strikes in third-party territories. As Iran inches closer to nuclear capabilities and Israel asserts its determination to prevent it at all costs, the stakes have never been higher. To understand how this modern Cold War came to define the region, and why its flames risk erupting into a wider conflagration, we must delve into the story of a friendship that collapsed into hatred, a rivalry that metastasized into a multi-front shadow war, and a regional chessboard where every move has global implications. Chapter 1: Allies in the Shadows, the Iran-Israel relationship before the revolution. Long before they became bitter enemies, Israel and Iran once shared a quiet, almost secretive alliance. In the complex dance of Cold War politics, ideology was often trumped by strategy, and geopolitics made strange bedfellows. Iran, under Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was a pro-Western monarchy, a linchpin of American strategy in the Middle East, and a rising oil power with ambitions of modernizing into a regional hegemon. Israel, isolated and surrounded by hostile Arab neighbors, desperately sought allies in a region where its existence was challenged from every direction. Thus, beneath a cloak of diplomatic ambiguity, the two nations found common ground. Throughout the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, Iran was one of only a handful of Muslim-majority nations that did not publicly denounce Israel. While the Shah did not formally recognize the Jewish state, lest he provoke the wrath of the Arab world, he allowed a range of back-channel dealings to flourish. Israeli military advisors trained Iranian forces. Mossad and Savak, the Shah's feared intelligence agency, collaborated in counterintelligence and internal security. Trade flowed in both directions, most notably Iranian oil powering Israeli industry, and Israeli agricultural and military technology bolstering Iran's ambitions. The alliance was also shaped by mutual enemies. Both nations viewed the rise of Pan-Arabism under Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser and later Syria's Ba'ath regime as a threat. Iran, with its long-standing rivalry with the Arabs and its Shia minority positioning, had little reason to support the populist pan-Arab causes that often came with a strong dose of anti-Persian sentiment. Israel, for its part, saw in Iran a non-Arab power with shared interests in countering Arab nationalism and Soviet-aligned regimes. One of the most critical symbols of this cooperation was Project Flower, a joint Iranian-Israeli initiative in the 1970s to develop advanced missile technology. Though the full extent of the project remained shrouded in secrecy, it revealed how deep the military collaboration had become. The fact that the two nations, one Jewish and the other an Islamic monarchy, could work together at such levels of sophistication was a testament to the pragmatism of their leadership, and the degree to which survival, more than ideology, dictated foreign policy. But this quiet friendship would not survive the tectonic shift that was about to shake the region. When the winds of revolution swept through Tehran in 1979, toppling the Shah and ushering in Ayatollah Khomeini's theocratic regime, Israel would go from quiet ally to sworn enemy almost overnight. Chapter 2. The Islamic Revolution and the Birth of Hostility. The year was 1979. The snow-capped mountains that loomed over Tehran seemed indifferent to the seismic shift trembling beneath their feet. For months, Iran had simmered with revolution. What began as a movement of political dissent and economic frustration had transformed into something deeper, more spiritual, more radical. The monarchy that had ruled with opulence and Western alignment now crumbled beneath the fury of millions. And at the center of it all stood a man in exile, an aging cleric whose quiet speeches and unwavering dogma would ripple across the Middle East for decades to come, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. From his exile in France, Khomeini had cultivated a message that resonated not just with the disaffected and the poor, but with a broader Iranian identity long overshadowed by imperialism, foreign influence, and Western puppetry. The Shah, once seen as a modernizing visionary, was increasingly viewed as a tyrant in the service of America and its allies, including Israel. His regime's close relationship with both nations only solidified that perception. To the revolutionaries pouring into the streets, the Shah was not just a monarch, he was a symbol of humiliation. And the nations he allied with, particularly Israel, became symbols of the same. When the Shah fled Iran and Khomeini returned in triumph, the Islamic Republic was born not as a mere change in government, but as a wholesale reordering of Iran's moral compass. This was not a secular revolution, it was a theocratic rebirth. In the new lexicon of Iran's foreign policy, the United States became the Great Satan, and Israel the Little Satan. These were not diplomatic jabs, they were existential condemnations. Israel was no longer a distant partner in the background of Cold War pragmatism. It was now the antithesis of everything the Islamic Republic claimed to represent. The transformation was swift and stark. The Israeli mission in Tehran was shuttered almost immediately, its diplomats forced to leave under a cloud of hostility. In its place, the PLO, then still considered a terrorist organization by much of the West, was welcomed with open arms and handed the keys to the former Israeli embassy. The walls that once held secret meetings and intelligence exchanges now bore murals of resistance and martyrdom. Photographs of dead Palestinian children replaced diplomatic portraits. In a single stroke, Iran had not only severed ties, it had flipped allegiances. But the rupture went deeper than just politics. At its core, Khomeini's revolution was built on the idea of Islamic sovereignty in defiance of imperialist control. To him and his followers, Israel represented a Western colonial project implanted in the heart of the Muslim world. It was seen not just as an occupying force in Palestine, but as an ideological affront to Islam itself. Zionism, in this worldview, was not merely political, it was spiritual corruption. Thus, to oppose Israel was not simply a matter of strategy, it was a religious obligation. This radical shift echoed far beyond Tehran. Throughout the region, Arab regimes watched with a mix of awe and anxiety. Israel, meanwhile, was stunned by the speed with which a quiet ally had turned into a thunderous enemy. Intelligence communities scrambled to recalibrate. Mossad's networks inside Iran, once robust and highly integrated, suddenly found themselves hunted. Israeli policymakers, already grappling with a hostile Arab world, now faced a new and unpredictable adversary whose ambitions were not just regional but messianic. The rupture also rewrote the map of Middle Eastern politics. Iran's open embrace of the Palestinian cause, particularly militant factions like Islamic Jihad and later Hamas, injected new energy into resistance movements. Tehran began funding and training operatives not just for war, but for a protracted ideological struggle. This was not to be a conventional war of armies, it was to be a holy war of attrition. In Jerusalem, Israel's leadership recognized the gravity of what had occurred. For decades, their strategic doctrine had relied on what was known as the periphery strategy, building quiet alliances with non-Arab states like Iran, Turkey, and Ethiopia to counterbalance the hostility of the Arab world. With Iran gone, that strategy had crumbled. Worse still, they now faced an adversary that not only rejected their existence, but sought to inspire generations to see its destruction as divine duty. And so, the foundations of a new conflict were laid. Not with armies lined on borders, but with ideology carved into the hearts of two nations. One believed its very survival depended on preventing Iranian influence from spreading. The other saw its moral purpose as resisting and, eventually, eradicating what it viewed as an illegitimate, foreign occupier. In many ways, the true war between Israel and Iran began not with bullets, but with words. And from those words, came decades of blood. Chapter 3. The Export of Revolution, Khomeini's Vision and Israel as the Antithesis. The Islamic Revolution was never intended to be an isolated phenomenon. From the earliest sermons broadcast from exile, Ayatollah Khomeini had made clear that his ambition was not simply to rule Iran, but to awaken the Islamic world. The birth of the Islamic Republic was, in his mind, a divine mandate, an ideological movement destined to spread far beyond Persia's borders. It was a revolution of faith, resistance, and purification, and its mission was to confront all forms of oppression, secularism, and Western influence wherever they lingered. At the epicenter of that confrontation stood Israel. To Khomeini and his inner circle, the State of Israel was more than a political rival. It was a symbol of modernity divorced from God, of imperialist arrogance masked as democracy, of Western decadence cloaked in nationalism. While the United States represented the global superpower corrupting Muslim lands through oil deals and military bases, Israel was seen as the regional avatar of that corruption. It was a scar on the map of Islam, an alien outpost sustained by force and deceit, encroaching upon the heart of the Muslim world. This view was not unique to Iran, but Khomeini gave it theological legitimacy. For decades, Arab states had opposed Israel primarily through the prism of territorial grievance and nationalism. Egypt, Syria, Jordan, each had fought Israel over land and identity. But the Islamic Republic of Iran framed its opposition in divine terms. It was not merely that Israel had displaced Palestinians, but that it existed in defiance of God's will. This was not a conflict to be solved through negotiation or recognition. It was a religious obligation to resist, indefinitely if necessary. From the very beginning, the Islamic Republic set out to institutionalize this resistance. Iran's constitution, drafted in the aftermath of the revolution, explicitly committed the country to support the oppressed over the oppressors and to extend aid to liberation movements, especially those in Muslim lands. Though not named directly, Israel was the obvious target of this clause. Within a few years, Tehran had become a central hub for Palestinian militant groups, providing them with funding, training, and weapons. But the Iranian effort went deeper than logistics. Khomeini sought to export his revolution by exporting its ideology. In Lebanon, where civil war raged and the Israeli military occupied parts of the south, Iran found fertile ground. It dispatched Revolutionary Guard commanders to train a new Shiite militia that would evolve into Hezbollah. This was not just a military force, it was an extension of the revolution itself, armed with rifles and Quranic verses, combining political indoctrination with guerrilla tactics. Hezbollah became the model for what Iran hoped to achieve elsewhere, a proxy force embedded within a community, guided by Islamic doctrine, and unwavering in its opposition to Israel and Western hegemony. Where Arab nationalism had failed, Iran's model offered a religious alternative. One that was uncorrupted by the compromises of diplomacy and untainted by the legacy of colonialism. In this model, Israel's destruction was not an endpoint but a moral imperative. Inside Iran, this messaging permeated every layer of society. School textbooks described Israel as an illegitimate entity. Friday sermons across the country echoed with chants of "Death to Israel." The regime created an annual holiday, Quds Day, to mark solidarity with the Palestinian cause and to reaffirm Iran's commitment to resisting the Zionist regime. Public spaces in Tehran were renamed after Palestinian martyrs. Billboards carried images of burning Israeli flags and slogans condemning the occupation. This was not mere propaganda, it was indoctrination, woven into the national identity. Israel, for its part, saw the storm coming. The Israeli intelligence community watched with growing concern as Iran expanded its influence not through conventional armies, but through ideology and proxies. What made Iran so dangerous was not just its rhetoric or its missiles, but its ability to inspire. Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, these were not random groups. They were connected by a single thread of resistance, backed by Iranian resolve, and animated by the belief that Israel's existence was temporary. The fear in Tel Aviv was not only that Iran would attack Israel directly, but that it would encircle it, bleeding it from all sides while preserving plausible deniability. This was asymmetrical warfare perfected, not with tanks and jets, but with conviction, with martyrdom, with patient erosion. Iran was betting that time was on its side, that Israel's technological edge could be neutralized by ideology that endured across generations. And yet, this export of revolution came at a cost. Iran's image in the Arab world was complicated. While many praised its support for Palestinians and its stance against the US and Israel, Sunni Arab leaders viewed its Shiite zeal and revolutionary agenda with suspicion. The same ideology that condemned Israel also threatened the legitimacy of monarchies and secular regimes in places like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Jordan. Iran's ambition to lead the Islamic world ran headfirst into the centuries-old divide between Sunni and Shia Islam. But for Iran, the central battle remained unchanged. Israel was the ideological foil by which the revolution measured itself. So long as the Zionist entity remained on the map, the revolution's mission remained incomplete. And in Tehran's eyes, supporting resistance, any resistance, was not an act of war. It was an act of justice. Thus, the conflict entered a new phase. No longer merely political or territorial, it became existential and theological. And as Iran poured money and doctrine into movements that stretched from Gaza to Beirut, Israel found itself surrounded not by armies, but by believers. Chapter 4: The Iran-Iraq War and Israel's Quiet Calculations. In September of 1980, the Middle East once again found itself engulfed in flames. Iraq, led by the brash and ambitious Saddam Hussein, launched a full-scale invasion of Iran, calculating that the Islamic Republic, still reeling from revolution and political purges, was ripe for conquest. What followed was one of the longest and bloodiest conflicts of the 20th century, a war of trenches, gas attacks, and human wave assaults that would grind on for 8 grueling years and claim nearly 1 million lives. But for Israel, the Iran-Iraq War was not just a humanitarian catastrophe unfolding on its periphery, it was a geopolitical dilemma of the highest order. Publicly, Israel remained silent. Official statements from Tel Aviv expressed concern over the violence and instability, but avoided taking sides. Privately, however, the Israeli leadership viewed the conflict through the cold lens of realpolitik. Neither Iran nor Iraq was a friend to Israel at this point, but the calculation was simple. A strong Iraq was more immediately dangerous than a wounded Iran. Saddam Hussein had made no secret of his ambitions. He saw himself as the heir to Nasser's pan-Arab legacy, a unifier of the Arab world, and a leader who could challenge both Western powers and Israel simultaneously. Iraq's military was one of the most formidable in the region, flush with oil revenue, bolstered by Soviet arms, and determined to assert dominance. In the early 1980s, it was Iraq, not Iran, that Israeli defense officials feared might one day attempt a conventional war against the Jewish state. Iran, by contrast, was consumed by internal chaos. The new Islamic Republic was still consolidating power. The military had been gutted by revolutionary purges, and the economy teetered under sanctions and mismanagement. Though its rhetoric was fiery, Iran's ability to project force was minimal. Thus, from an Israeli perspective, a prolonged war that kept both adversaries weakened was a desirable, if morally murky, outcome. But Israel's strategic concern was not just the duration of the war, it was the flow of weapons. As the conflict dragged on, Iran found itself increasingly isolated. The United States, still nursing the wounds of the 1979 hostage crisis, had no interest in assisting Tehran. Most of the Arab world, eager to contain the revolutionary fervor of Shia Islam, lined up behind Saddam. Iran was being bled dry and was running out of options. It was in this context that one of the most controversial and secretive chapters in the Israel-Iran relationship unfolded: covert arms transfers. Despite Iran's vocal hostility toward Israel, and despite the regime's public denouncement of Zionism, intermediaries began reaching out to Tel Aviv. The message was simple. Tehran needed weapons. Specifically, spare parts for US-made equipment left over from the Shah's reign, most notably American F-4 Phantoms and Hawk anti-aircraft systems. Israel, having experience with such equipment and holding stocks of compatible parts, was uniquely positioned to provide them. The Israeli leadership faced a dilemma. Supporting Iran, even covertly, seemed contradictory. But doing so had strategic benefits. It prolonged the war, prevented Saddam from gaining a decisive victory, and created leverage over an increasingly isolated regime. Moreover, there was hope, however slim, that quiet cooperation might temper Tehran's hostility, or at least open channels for intelligence gathering. And so, under a shroud of secrecy, Israeli arms found their way into Iranian hands. This covert arrangement later became a part of the broader Iran-Contra affair, a scandal that rocked the Reagan administration in the mid-1980s. The United States, through intermediaries including Israel, had secretly sold arms to Iran in the hope of securing the release of American hostages held by Hezbollah in Lebanon, while simultaneously funneling the profits to anti-communist rebels in Nicaragua. The revelation that Israel had played a key logistical role shocked many, but it made sense to those familiar with the deep logic of regional survival. For Israel, the goal was never to strengthen Iran, but to balance threats. It was a classic application of the ancient Middle Eastern dictum, "The enemy of my enemy is my tool." By keeping both Iran and Iraq engaged, Israel bought itself time to focus on more immediate threats in Lebanon and Syria. It also allowed Mossad to gather valuable intelligence on the shifting sands of Iranian military capabilities. Yet, there was a deeper irony unfolding beneath the surface. While Israel supplied spare parts and ammunition, Iran's leaders continued to denounce the Zionist regime with apocalyptic fervor. Ayatollah Khomeini issued fatwas condemning Israel's existence. State-run newspapers in Tehran published caricatures of Israeli leaders as demons and tyrants. The chants of "death to Israel" never abated. And yet, in the shadows, elements of the regime did business with the very enemy they condemned. The contradiction was not lost on the Iranian people. Whispers of hypocrisy circulated, and some questioned whether ideological purity was being sacrificed for survival. But in times of war, survival often trumps doctrine. When the Iran-Iraq War finally ended in 1988, both countries were exhausted. Iraq had gained little but debt and bitterness. Iran, though defiant, was left with shattered cities and a generation of martyrs. But for Israel, the war had achieved a bitter strategic benefit: it had delayed both of its adversaries, bought time to rebuild its regional posture, and allowed for deeper entrenchment of its alliances with the West. However, the covert contact did not thaw relations. If anything, it confirmed the paranoia of Iran's ruling clerics. They saw Western and Israeli pragmatism as further proof of Zionist manipulation, of a global system rigged against the Islamic world. And Israel, having played a quiet but significant role in prolonging the war, found itself more firmly entrenched in the minds of Iranian hardliners as a threat to be countered, by any means necessary. Thus, as the guns fell silent along the Iran-Iraq border, a different kind of war began to take shape, quieter, colder, and far more dangerous. Chapter 5. The rise of Hezbollah, Iran's proxy on Israel's doorstep. As the smoke of the Iran-Iraq war slowly cleared, Iran's revolutionary ambitions remained intact. The war had not dulled Tehran's ideological fervor, rather, it had sharpened it. The Islamic Republic emerged more committed than ever to exporting its ideals and challenging what it perceived as the Zionist and imperialist architecture dominating the region. And nowhere did this commitment manifest more clearly, or more dangerously for Israel, than in Lebanon, a nation fractured by civil war and foreign occupation, where Iran would sow the seeds of one of its most enduring and lethal legacies, Hezbollah. In the early 1980s, Lebanon was a landscape of chaos. The country had been torn apart by civil war since 1975, a brutal conflict that pitted Christian militias against Muslim factions, Palestinian fighters against Lebanese warlords, and foreign actors against one another in a labyrinthine struggle for control. Into this void stepped Israel, which launched a full-scale invasion of southern Lebanon in 1982. The official aim was to push back the Palestine Liberation Organization, which had been launching attacks into northern Israel. But the invasion quickly spiraled into a long and controversial occupation. For Iran, the chaos in Lebanon presented a golden opportunity. In the wake of the Israeli invasion, and under the protective umbrella of the Syrian regime, then an ally of Tehran, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, dispatched operatives to the Bekaa Valley. Their mission was not simply to aid Lebanon's Shiite population, which had long been marginalized, but to create a new force. A militant movement that would marry Lebanese grievances with Iranian ideology, and that would serve as a permanent thorn in Israel's side. What emerged was Hezbollah, or the Party of God. It began modestly, a collection of radical clerics, disillusioned Amal fighters, and young Shiite men galvanized by the revolution in Iran and the suffering inflicted by Israeli airstrikes and occupation. But with Iranian funding, weapons, training, and religious indoctrination, Hezbollah quickly evolved into something far more sophisticated and enduring than any militia Lebanon had seen before. It was not just a paramilitary force, it was a state within a state, complete with social services, schools, hospitals, and a political wing that would eventually secure seats in the Lebanese parliament. From its inception, Hezbollah's identity was inseparable from its commitment to confronting Israel. The group's 1985 founding manifesto laid out its goals in stark, uncompromising terms: the expulsion of Western powers from Lebanon, the destruction of the Zionist entity, and the establishment of an Islamic regime in Lebanon modeled after Iran. Hezbollah would go on to carry out some of the deadliest attacks against Israeli and Jewish targets, including the 1983 suicide bombing of the U.S. Marine barracks in Beirut, and a series of kidnappings and assassinations throughout the 1980s and 1990s. For Israel, Hezbollah was a nightmare come to life. Unlike the PLO, Hezbollah was not a secular nationalist movement that could be negotiated with or bribed into compromise. It was a religious movement, steeped in martyrdom and theology, with direct patronage from Tehran and unwavering resolve. It operated in the shadows, used civilians as shields, and understood that victory did not require conquest, only survival and resistance. Hezbollah's emergence also marked a new phase in Iran's strategy. Rather than confront Israel directly, Iran would encircle it with proxy forces. It would create a web of militant organizations capable of bleeding the Jewish state through asymmetrical warfare, thereby eroding its security, exhausting its military, and undermining its psychological resilience. Hezbollah became the prototype for this doctrine, and its success would later inspire similar models in Gaza, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. The 1990s saw Hezbollah evolve further. As Israel maintained its occupation of southern Lebanon, Hezbollah waged a relentless campaign of guerrilla attacks, ambushes, and rocket strikes. It developed a network of tunnels, fortified villages, and decentralized command structures. Iranian advisors helped refine its military tactics, and Iranian money ensured that its institutions thrived even as Lebanon's central government remained paralyzed. In 2000, Israel withdrew from southern Lebanon after nearly 2 decades of bloody occupation. To the world, it was a strategic recalibration. To Hezbollah, and by extension to Iran, it was proof that armed resistance could work. The withdrawal was heralded as a historic victory for the Islamic resistance, and it catapulted Hezbollah's leader, Hassan Nasrallah, into regional stardom. Iran celebrated the moment as a vindication of its revolutionary export strategy. But the story didn't end there. In 2006, war broke out again. Hezbollah launched a cross-border raid, killing and capturing Israeli soldiers. Israel responded with overwhelming force, launching airstrikes across Lebanon and deploying ground troops in a campaign that would last 34 days. The war ended in a UN-brokered ceasefire, but the damage was immense. Over 1,000 Lebanese dead, much of Beirut's southern suburbs in ruins, and Israel suffering dozens of casualties and an uncharacteristically shaken sense of deterrence. The 2006 war revealed the full maturity of Hezbollah as a fighting force, and by extension, the effectiveness of Iran's strategy. Despite Israel's military superiority, Hezbollah had survived, and in doing so, reinforced the idea that Iran's proxy model could bleed even the most powerful adversaries. For Tehran, Hezbollah was not just a client, it was a living extension of its will, capable of influencing events in the region and serving as both sword and shield. From that point forward, Hezbollah and Iran became inseparable in the Israeli psyche. Every rocket fired from southern Lebanon, every arms shipment intercepted, every speech by Nasrallah was seen as Tehran's message delivered through a Lebanese mouthpiece. Hezbollah was no longer just a militia. It was a northern front in Iran's shadow war against Israel. And so, what had begun as a local Lebanese response to foreign occupation had grown into a regional axis of confrontation. With Hezbollah, Iran had found a way to place itself directly on Israel's border, to threaten Tel Aviv without firing a single Iranian bullet. It was a strategic masterstroke, and a warning of the long conflict still to come. Chapter 6: The First Intifada and Iran's Expansion into Palestinian Politics. As the 1980s drew to a close, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict entered a volatile and transformative phase. On December 9, 1987, a spark ignited in the Gaza Strip. An Israeli military truck collided with a car carrying 4 Palestinians, killing them. The accident, seemingly mundane on the surface, unleashed a wave of fury that had long been simmering under occupation. From Gaza to the West Bank, Palestinian youths took to the streets. They threw stones, built barricades, and faced off against Israeli soldiers armed with rifles. What began as a spontaneous eruption of anger soon coalesced into a nationwide uprising, the Intifada, or shaking off. The First Intifada would last for years and fundamentally reshape the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. It marked a shift away from externally based organizations like the PLO and placed the focus on grassroots resistance within the occupied territories. The imagery of children facing tanks, of women leading marches, of entire communities refusing to submit, this transformed the Palestinian struggle from an armed insurgency into a broader civil resistance movement. It also captivated the global stage and redefined how the world saw the conflict. For Iran, the uprising was both an opportunity and a challenge. On one hand, it had long positioned itself as a champion of the Palestinian cause, rhetorically aligning itself with liberation and anti-Zionism since the days of the revolution. On the other hand, the dominant force in Palestinian politics at the time was the secular PLO, led by Yasser Arafat, a figure who did not share Iran's Islamist worldview and who had maintained ties, however strained, with many Sunni Arab regimes. Yet the Intifada offered something different. A chance for Tehran to move beyond rhetoric and begin shaping events inside the Palestinian territories themselves. Iran's ideological machinery began to pivot. While continuing to support the PLO symbolically, it increasingly turned its gaze toward Islamist elements within the Palestinian resistance, groups that mirrored its own revolutionary theology and offered a religious alternative to the secular nationalism that had long dominated Palestinian politics. Chief among these was a fledgling movement born from the Muslim Brotherhood and nurtured in the mosques and refugee camps of Gaza, Hamas. Though Hamas would not formally declare its existence until 1988, the organization had already begun to emerge as a grassroots alternative to the PLO's more top-down leadership. It emphasized Islamic values, social services, and religious resistance. And in its founding charter, Hamas made clear that its goal was not just the liberation of Palestine, but the complete destruction of Israel through jihad. This vision aligned perfectly with Tehran's ideology. Iran saw in Hamas a Sunni counterpart to Hezbollah, an Islamist movement grounded in popular support, animated by religious conviction, and opposed to any compromise with the Jewish state. Though theological differences remained, Shia versus Sunni, Persian versus Arab, the political and strategic logic of the alliance was undeniable. The enemy of Israel was a friend of Iran. Throughout the early 1990s, Iran began to funnel funds, arms, and training to Hamas and other Islamist factions such as Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Though these efforts were initially modest, they laid the groundwork for a relationship that would deepen dramatically in the decades to come. Iran's involvement was not always direct. Funds were channeled through intermediaries, weapons delivered by circuitous routes, and training conducted quietly in Lebanon or Syria. But the pattern was clear. Tehran was embedding itself within the Palestinian resistance not just as a supporter, but as a shaper of its future. Israel, watching from the sidelines, recognized the growing complexity of the threat. The Intifada had already exposed the limitations of military power in quelling civil unrest. Now, it faced the prospect of an internal Palestinian resistance that was increasingly influenced by Iran's revolutionary fervor. And unlike the PLO, which had shown a willingness, however tentative, to negotiate, groups like Hamas and Islamic Jihad rejected compromise outright. This dynamic came to a head in the early 1990s with the launch of the Oslo peace process. As Israel and the PLO inched toward recognition and negotiation, Iran ramped up its support for the factions that rejected peace. Tehran denounced Oslo as a betrayal of the Palestinian cause and framed the negotiations as a Zionist plot to neuter resistance. It encouraged its proxies to sabotage the process, whether through suicide bombings, assassinations, or public denunciations. In Iran's calculus, any diplomatic success for Israel was a strategic defeat for the revolution. The strategy paid dividends. While the PLO lost credibility for its inability to deliver a meaningful peace, Iran's proxies gained legitimacy on the Palestinian street. Hamas, in particular, began to be seen as the true voice of the people. A movement that did not waver in its commitment to resistance, that built schools and clinics as it prepared rockets and tunnels. Thus, by the end of the First Intifada, Iran had firmly planted its flag inside the Palestinian resistance. No longer confined to ideological pronouncements or symbolic gestures, Tehran was now a material force in the struggle against Israel. It had forged relationships, established channels, and begun cultivating a network that would grow more lethal with time. This was the new face of the conflict, a convergence of ideological fervor, grassroots militancy, and strategic patience. Israel was no longer facing a unified Palestinian nationalism, it was facing a fractured resistance, one part open to diplomacy, the other hardened by faith and armed by Iran. And Tehran, far from Israel's borders, smiled in shadowed silence, watching the seeds of revolution take root in the soil of occupation. Chapter 7. Nuclear Shadows, Iran's Atomic Ambitions and Israel's Red Lines. In the heart of Iran's central desert, near the ancient city of Natanz, construction began on a facility that would alter the strategic balance of the Middle East for decades to come. At first, it seemed innocuous, just another industrial site amid the vast barrenness of Isfahan province. But beneath the surface, literally and geopolitically, a new chapter in the Israel-Iran conflict was unfolding. It was not a chapter of rockets or revolutions, but of centrifuges, uranium enrichment, and the terrifying specter of nuclear war. Iran's nuclear ambitions dated back to the 1950s, during the reign of the Shah. Under the US-backed Atoms for Peace program, Iran had received American assistance to develop civilian nuclear energy. By the 1970s, the Shah had grand plans for a fleet of nuclear reactors and even hinted at a future Iranian bomb. Justified, he argued, by the need to counterbalance a nuclear-armed Israel. But with the Islamic Revolution, those ambitions were momentarily frozen. The new regime condemned the nuclear program as a symbol of Western corruption and halted many of its projects. That stance, however, would not last. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, as Iran recovered from the war with Iraq, its strategic calculus began to shift. Surrounded by hostile neighbors, isolated by sanctions, and increasingly at odds with both the United States and Israel, the Iranian leadership began to view nuclear capability not as heresy, but as necessity. They watched as India and Pakistan gained regional clout after testing their own bombs. They saw how North Korea, despite its pariah status, was treated with a certain deference thanks to its nuclear deterrent. Most of all, they saw Israel, widely believed to possess dozens of nuclear warheads, standing untouchable, immune to existential threats. To Iran's ruling elite, nuclear power represented more than energy independence. It was survival, insurance against invasion, a symbol of sovereignty, and above all, a tool of deterrence. While Iran always claimed its nuclear program was peaceful, aimed at producing medical isotopes and electricity, suspicions mounted as uranium enrichment facilities were discovered hidden from international inspectors, as procurement networks crisscrossed the globe in secrecy, and as enrichment levels crept higher toward weapons-grade thresholds. Israel, for its part, viewed the Iranian nuclear program not through the lens of balance, but of annihilation. The specter of a nuclear-armed Iran was more than just a strategic threat, it was an existential one. Israeli memory is haunted by the Holocaust, and its foreign policy is undergirded by a doctrine of absolute self-defense. Never again is not just rhetoric, it is a call to perpetual vigilance. The thought of a regime that openly calls for Israel's destruction, armed with the world's deadliest weapons, triggered a red line that no Israeli leader, left, right, or center, was willing to cross. From the mid-1990s onward, Israeli intelligence agencies began devoting immense resources to tracking Iran's nuclear progress. The Mossad, Israel's foreign intelligence agency, infiltrated procurement networks, recruited assets, and launched surveillance missions deep inside Iranian territory. Their conclusions were consistent and chilling. Iran was not just inching toward nuclear capability, it was determined to acquire it under the cover of deniability. Successive Israeli prime ministers raised the alarm. Benjamin Netanyahu, in particular, made confronting Iran's nuclear program the centerpiece of his political career. In speeches at the United Nations, in closed-door meetings with Western leaders, and in front of domestic audiences, he warned that time was running out. In 2012, he famously held up a cartoon bomb diagram at the UN General Assembly, drawing a red line near the top to signify the point at which Iran's enrichment progress would become irreversible. But beyond rhetoric, Israel also acted. According to numerous reports, Israeli agents assassinated key Iranian nuclear scientists in a series of precise and brazen operations between 2010 and 2012. Motorcycles pulled up beside cars on Tehran streets. Magnetic bombs were affixed to doors. Remote-controlled detonations eliminated physicists in broad daylight. The message was clear: Israel would not allow Iran to reach nuclear breakout, no matter the cost. In parallel, Israel launched a new kind of warfare, cyber war. The Stuxnet virus, uncovered in 2010, became the first known digital weapon to cause real-world destruction. A joint operation between the United States and Israel, Stuxnet targeted the Natanz enrichment facility and sabotaged centrifuges, causing them to malfunction while displaying normal readings to Iranian operators. It was a technological marvel, and a clear signal that the battlefield had expanded beyond the physical into the digital realm. Iran, though shocked, did not back down. Its nuclear scientists were replaced, facilities repaired, and enrichment resumed. The Islamic Republic viewed the Israeli attacks as further evidence that its nuclear ambitions were justified. It pointed to Israel's own undeclared nuclear arsenal, estimated at 80 to 100 warheads, and accused the West of double standards. Tehran insisted it had the right to develop peaceful nuclear technology under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, and that Israel's opposition was rooted not in legality but in maintaining its regional monopoly on deterrence. The conflict thus entered a dangerous stalemate. Israel viewed a nuclear Iran as an unacceptable threat. Iran viewed Israel's sabotage and assassinations as acts of war. Both sides continued their covert campaigns, each escalating in capability and audacity. For the first time, the conflict carried the potential to move beyond proxy wars and cross into the realm of direct strategic confrontation. Diplomatic efforts waxed and waned, culminating in the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, in 2015, a nuclear deal between Iran and world powers aimed at limiting enrichment in exchange for sanctions relief. Israel, however, vehemently opposed the agreement. It saw the deal not as a solution, but as a dangerous pause that allowed Iran to preserve its infrastructure, gain economic relief, and emerge stronger in the long term. Netanyahu made the unprecedented step of addressing the U.S. Congress without White House coordination to denounce the deal. In his view, the JCPOA was appeasement disguised as diplomacy, and it would one day lead to a nuclear-armed theocracy capable of blackmailing the world and threatening Israel's survival. And so, beneath the deserts of Iran and the corridors of power in Jerusalem, a new phase of the Israel-Iran conflict unfolded, not in the language of resistance or occupation, but in kilotons and enrichment percentages. It was a shadow war of unprecedented stakes. For one side, a deterrent. For the other, a death sentence. In this nuclear standoff, the margin for error shrank. The stakes grew unimaginably high. And the clock, on both sides, kept ticking. Chapter 8, The Axis of Resistance vs. the Western Alliance. As the 21st century advanced, the conflict between Israel and Iran no longer confined itself to bilateral hostility, it had morphed into a confrontation between two rival coalitions, each with its own worldview, military networks, and ideological foundations. On one side stood Iran and its network of allies and proxies, a constellation Tehran proudly referred to as the Axis of Resistance. On the other stood Israel and its increasingly global web of partners. Military, intelligence, and economic, anchored by the United States and supported by growing cooperation with Arab states. The stage was no longer just the Levant or the Persian Gulf, it was the entire Middle East, and in many ways, the entire world. The term Axis of Resistance was coined in the early 2000s by Iranian and Hezbollah officials as a way to brand their network of armed and ideological partners resisting Western hegemony and Israeli influence. At the heart of this axis were Iran, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Assad regime in Syria, and Hamas and Islamic Jihad in the Palestinian territories. Over time, the alliance would expand to include Shia militias in Iraq, the Houthi rebels in Yemen, and even elements sympathetic to Iran's ideology in Bahrain and beyond. This alliance was not bound by treaties or uniformity of belief, it was united by a shared opposition to three things: American imperialism, Israeli existence, and Sunni authoritarian regimes aligned with the West, particularly Saudi Arabia and the Gulf monarchies. Iran positioned itself as the ideological and logistical center of this movement, offering arms, training, funding, and political support in exchange for loyalty and alignment. Hezbollah served as the model and the gold standard. A proxy that had proven its effectiveness in combat, its resilience under pressure, and its ability to operate both as a militia and a political party. It became Iran's northern frontline against Israel and a training ground for other militias. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, particularly its elite Quds force, oversaw the coordination of these groups, often using Syria and Iraq as logistical corridors. The Syrian civil war, which erupted in 2011, became the crucible in which this alliance was tested and solidified. When Bashar al-Assad's regime came under siege from a patchwork of rebels, Islamists, and foreign-backed opposition groups, Iran viewed his survival as critical. Syria was not just an ally, it was a bridge connecting Tehran to Hezbollah and, through them, to Israel's northern border. The fall of Assad would sever that bridge. Thus, Iran poured resources, advisors, and fighters into the Syrian theater. Hezbollah followed, fighting alongside Syrian government troops and other Iranian-backed militias. Together, they helped turn the tide of the war. But their presence also transformed Syria into a de facto Iranian forward base. Missile factories, weapons depots, drone workshops, and training centers were established across Syrian territory. For Israel, this was an intolerable development. The prospect of an Iranian military infrastructure so close to its border prompted an aggressive campaign of airstrikes, targeting convoys, warehouses, and command centers. These strikes became so frequent that Israeli defense officials referred to it as the war between the wars, a continuous effort to degrade Iran's capabilities without triggering a full-scale regional war. While Iran built its axis, Israel doubled down on its alliance with the West. The United States remained its indispensable partner, providing billions of dollars in military aid, state-of-the-art weapon systems, intelligence sharing, and diplomatic cover. The U.S. commitment to Israel's security was bipartisan and enduring, enshrined in decades of strategic memoranda and defense cooperation acts. Beyond Washington, Israel began to expand its reach, cultivating new relationships with Europe, Africa, and, most crucially, the Arab Gulf. The once unthinkable became reality. As Iran's influence spread and its proxies threatened shared regional interests, Sunni Arab regimes quietly began to see Israel not as the enemy of the past, but as a potential partner of the future. Intelligence officials from Israel and Saudi Arabia began to meet discreetly. UAE and Israeli companies quietly explored joint ventures. Egypt and Jordan, already at peace with Israel, deepened security coordination. These undercurrents would eventually erupt into the daylight with the Abraham Accords, but even before the formal normalization, the realignment was underway. This realignment created a regional dichotomy. On one side, the axis of resistance, ideologically motivated, often decentralized, and heavily armed. On the other, the Western-aligned bloc, wealthy, technologically advanced, and increasingly coordinated. Israel was no longer an isolated entity surrounded by Arab hostility. It was emerging as a pivotal node in a broader counter-Iranian coalition. This transformation was not without consequence. The axis of resistance intensified its activities. Hezbollah expanded its missile arsenal to over 100,000 projectiles, many capable of striking deep inside Israel. Hamas, supported by Iranian know-how and smuggled materials, began manufacturing longer-range rockets in Gaza. In Iraq, groups like Kataib Hezbollah and Asaib al-Haq gained political power while targeting American and Israeli-linked interests. In Yemen, the Houthis used Iranian drones to strike Saudi oil fields and threatened to turn their arsenal toward Israel. The confrontation thus became multi-front, multi-layered, and perpetual. Israel invested heavily in missile defense, Iron Dome, David's Sling, and the Arrow systems, while developing new technologies to counter drones and cyber attacks. Iran, meanwhile, cultivated redundancy in its networks. If Hezbollah were neutralized, Iraqi militias could strike. If Gaza were sealed, Syria could serve as a launchpad. This layered approach ensured that Israel could never fully relax, never truly disarm, never escape the sense of being encircled. But perhaps the most enduring aspect of this confrontation was its ideological rigidity. The axis of resistance viewed compromise as betrayal. Negotiation was a tool of delay. Peace with Israel was not peace, it was surrender. And in Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and Washington, the belief hardened that Iran's goal was not deterrence, but destruction. Each side interpreted the other's actions as confirmation of its own fears, feeding a feedback loop of paranoia and escalation. In many ways, the Israel-Iran conflict had ceased to be a conflict between two states. It had become a clash of visions. A contest between a revolutionary ideology that sought to upend the existing order, and a deeply entrenched state determined to defend its right to exist by any means necessary. It was no longer just a war of bombs and bullets. It was a war of networks, of alliances, of narratives. And it showed no sign of slowing. Chapter 9, Assassinations and Espionage, The War in the Shadows. Beyond the flash of missiles and the thunder of airstrikes, a darker, more invisible dimension of the Israel-Iran conflict has unfolded, one fought in the murk of foreign cities, in whispered phone calls, and through the eyes of satellites and encrypted servers. It is a war of espionage and sabotage, of assassinations and cyber intrusions, where deniability is as crucial as lethality. In this clandestine theater, both nations have proven capable, cunning, and deeply committed to outmaneuvering the other. For Israel, espionage has always been central to its national security doctrine. From its very inception, surrounded by enemies and outnumbered by hostile neighbors, Israel relied on intelligence as its great equalizer. The Mossad, its foreign intelligence agency, grew into one of the world's most feared and respected organizations. Renowned for its audacity, precision, and reach. Against Iran, Mossad has waged one of its most complex and enduring operations, one defined not only by collection of intelligence but by active, relentless disruption. This disruption has taken many forms, but few are as shocking or as controversial as the series of assassinations carried out against Iranian nuclear scientists. Beginning in the late 2000s, a pattern began to emerge. Key figures in Iran's nuclear program were being systematically targeted. In 2010, Masoud Ali Mohammadi, a physics professor, was killed by a remote-controlled bomb in Tehran. The following year, Majid Shahriari died in a car bombing, while another nuclear expert, Faridun Abbasi, narrowly survived an attempt on his life. In each case, the precision and method of the attack pointed to professional operatives with advanced surveillance, local networks, and an intimate knowledge of their targets' routines. Iran immediately blamed Israel. Though Tel Aviv refused to confirm or deny involvement, the message was unmistakable: those who built the infrastructure of the Iranian bomb would be hunted. The Mossad, operating through carefully managed assets and local collaborators, penetrated deep into Iranian society. Eavesdropping on conversations, surveilling sensitive sites, and building dossiers on individuals critical to the nuclear enterprise. For Israel, these assassinations were not just tactical strikes, they were warnings, deterrents, and delays. Perhaps the most dramatic episode came in November 2020, when Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, considered the father of Iran's nuclear program, was killed in an ambush outside Tehran. Reports later suggested that the operation involved a remote-controlled machine gun mounted on a vehicle, operated via satellite, and equipped with facial recognition technology to avoid collateral casualties. It was a feat of extraordinary sophistication, more akin to science fiction than conventional espionage. The fact that it occurred in the heart of Iran, despite the intense protection surrounding Fakhrizadeh, was a testament to the reach of Israeli intelligence. Iran responded with fury, vowing revenge and accusing not only Israel but also Western collaborators. Yet even as it grieved its losses, Tehran remained locked in its own shadow war. The Islamic Republic's intelligence services, particularly the Ministry of Intelligence and the Quds Force, launched a counteroffensive that spanned continents. Iranian agents plotted attacks on Israeli diplomats in Thailand and India, attempted bombings in Georgia, and sought to assassinate dissidents and journalists abroad. Iranian-linked cyber groups also began probing Israel's infrastructure, targeting banks, government websites, and even water treatment systems. The digital domain became a new and increasingly vital battleground. The 2010 revelation of Stuxnet, a cyber weapon jointly developed by Israel and the United States, was a watershed moment. The virus had infected Iran's Natanz facility and sabotaged centrifuges without detection, setting back the nuclear program significantly. More importantly, it marked the first known instance of a cyber attack causing physical destruction. It redefined the rules of engagement and demonstrated that cyber warfare had matured into a potent tool of statecraft. In response, Iran ramped up its own cyber capabilities. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps sponsored a wave of cyber units tasked with attacking Israeli digital infrastructure. Israeli oil refineries, transportation systems, and even dating websites were targeted. In some instances, Iranian hackers released personal data of Israeli civilians, aiming to sow panic and mistrust. Cyber attacks became daily skirmishes, often invisible to the public, but deeply felt in the defense and intelligence communities. Beyond the battlefield of circuits and code, human intelligence remained vital. Iranian defectors, double agents, and insiders have reportedly fed Israel with critical information. In 2018, Prime Minister Netanyahu unveiled what he claimed was a massive intelligence coup. Israeli agents had infiltrated a warehouse in Tehran, seized a trove of secret nuclear documents, and exfiltrated them back to Israel. The documents included blueprints, communications, and photographs that purportedly proved Iran's efforts to preserve knowledge for a future nuclear breakout. The operation, dramatic and unprecedented, was not only a tactical victory, it was a strategic blow to Iran's credibility and a tool to rally international pressure. But this shadow war was not without cost. Both nations risked escalation with every operation. A misstep, a civilian casualty, or a public exposure could trigger broader conflict. In 2021, an Iranian tanker was attacked off the coast of Oman. A few months later, Israeli-owned vessels came under fire. In this tit-for-tat dance, the line between espionage and open war blurred. Moreover, both sides had to contend with the psychological toll. For Israeli citizens, living under the constant threat of Iranian proxies and cyber attacks created a sense of siege. For Iranians, the knowledge that foreign agents operated freely inside their borders undermined the regime's image of control. Trust eroded. Paranoia flourished. Yet, for all its darkness, the war in the shadows revealed a deeper truth. Both Israel and Iran understood that a direct, open conflict would be catastrophic. Neither wanted an all-out war, but neither was willing to stand idle. And so they struck from the dark, wounding without appearing to bleed, denying what they could not hide. This was not peace. It was not even Cold War. It was a war of ghosts, fought in silence, recorded in whispers, and remembered only in the absence of the next attack. Chapter 10: The Abraham Accords and the Strategic Realignment. In the heat of the Gulf, beneath the opulent chandeliers of Emirati palaces and across the marble floors of Bahraini ministries, a quiet but profound revolution was taking place, one that would send tremors through the very foundation of the Israel-Iran conflict. On August 13, 2020, the world awoke to a diplomatic bombshell. Israel and the United Arab Emirates had agreed to normalize relations. A month later, Bahrain followed. By the year's end, Sudan and Morocco would also join in. These weren't just political agreements, they were tectonic shifts in a region long defined by suspicion, bloodshed, and ideological intransigence. Collectively, they became known as the Abraham Accords. For decades, Israel had existed in an uneasy neighborhood. Recognized by few, shunned by many, and formally at peace with only two Arab states, Egypt and Jordan. The prevailing Arab position, first articulated in the 1967 Khartoum Resolution and reiterated in the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002, had been simple: no recognition, no negotiation, no peace with Israel until a just resolution for the Palestinians was achieved. That doctrine, held rigidly for generations, had finally cracked. But the Abraham Accords were not born out of sentimentality or softened ideologies. They were forged in the crucible of shared fears, chief among them, the rise of Iran. For years, Sunni Arab monarchies had watched with alarm as Tehran extended its reach across the region. From the Gulf to the Levant, Iran's proxies and militias carved out zones of influence, challenging not only Israel but also the legitimacy of Arab rulers. The Islamic Republic's ideological model. A theocratic government driven by revolutionary zeal, posed a direct threat to the dynastic order of the Gulf. Covert cooperation between Israel and these Arab states had existed for years. Intelligence exchanges, back-channel meetings, and shared concerns over Iran's regional ambitions had quietly drawn Israel and the Gulf closer. But the Abraham Accords marked the moment these clandestine dealings stepped into the sunlight. They formalized a new axis. One no longer tethered to old ideological commitments, but anchored instead in a mutual desire to contain Iran, promote regional stability, and embrace economic and technological integration. The implications for Iran were profound and deeply unsettling. Suddenly, Israel's strategic perimeter had expanded. Where once it faced encirclement by Arab hostility, it now found allies, or at least partners, on Iran's western and southern flanks. Emirati and Bahraini ports, airfields, and intelligence outposts could be used, in theory or in practice, to monitor and counter Iranian movements in the Persian Gulf and beyond. Cyber cooperation, arms sales, and joint military drills followed, signaling that this was no mere ceremonial peace, it was a functional alliance in the making. Iran responded with predictable fury. It denounced the accords as betrayal, accusing the Gulf monarchies of selling out the Palestinian cause and capitulating to Zionist influence. Ayatollah Khamenei declared that these nations would be disgraced forever. Iran's proxies ramped up their rhetoric and attacks, Houthi missiles struck deeper into Saudi Arabia, and Hezbollah renewed its threats along Israel's northern border. But beneath the bluster was something more dangerous. A sense of encirclement, of isolation, and of urgency. For Tehran, the Abraham Accords represented the formalization of what it had long feared, a regional bloc, backed by the United States, designed to contain and possibly roll back Iranian influence. This new alignment was not just diplomatic, it was strategic, technological, and psychological. Israeli companies began investing in Emirati infrastructure. Tourism flourished. Defense ministers shared platforms. The taboo had not just been broken, it had been replaced with opportunity. And the symbolism mattered. The name itself, Abraham, invoked a shared patriarch between Jews and Muslims, a reminder of ancient kinship used now to justify modern rapprochement. It suggested that history's wounds could be healed, and that pragmatism could triumph over ideology. But for Iran, that same symbolism was hollow, an insult, even. In their view, peace with Israel was peace with oppression. The embrace of the Zionist enemy was nothing short of apostasy. Israel, meanwhile, moved quickly to cement these new relationships. Arms deals, security pacts, and intelligence cooperation were accelerated. The once isolated Jewish state was now a regional hub for high-tech, agriculture, and energy innovation. In return, the Gulf states gained access to Israeli cyber defense systems, agricultural technology, and powerful lobbying networks in Washington. The benefits were mutual, measurable, and, crucially, premised on shared threat perception: Iran. The Biden administration, while publicly committed to diplomacy with Iran, recognized the utility of the Abraham Accords and encouraged their expansion. The idea of a broader anti-Iran coalition, stretching from the Red Sea to the Hindu Kush, began to take shape. Talks of expanding the accords to include Saudi Arabia circulated widely. Though Riyadh remained cautious, preferring to engage quietly, the message was clear: the winds were shifting, and Iran was increasingly on the defensive. For Palestinians, the Abraham Accords were a bitter pill. They watched as Arab states bypassed them, normalizing ties with Israel without securing concessions or a final status agreement. Iran seized on this grievance, portraying itself as the last true defender of Palestinian rights. But even this narrative began to fray as Hamas, long a recipient of Iranian support, found itself drawn into the broader power politics of the region, balancing its need for funding with the shifting allegiances of its neighbors. The Abraham Accords did not end the Israel-Iran conflict, but they transformed its contours. They turned Israel from a regional outcast into a central player in a new Middle Eastern order. They transformed Iran's image from a revolutionary standard-bearer to a disruptive outlier. And they created a framework for regional security that, while still fragile, was increasingly focused on containment of the Islamic Republic. This was no longer just a bilateral feud. It was a regional chess match, with new rules, new players, and new stakes. And once again, the center of gravity shifted, not with a bang, but with the signature of a document, and the opening of an embassy. Chapter 11. Iran's reach into Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. In the volatile terrain of the Middle East, where borders are often contested and loyalties frequently shift, Iran has mastered the art of influence without occupation. Through a shrewd combination of ideology, opportunism, and shadowy paramilitary networks, the Islamic Republic has extended its reach far beyond its own borders, entrenching itself deeply in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. This expansion, while ostensibly aimed at building a strategic depth to protect the regime, has dramatically altered the dynamics of the Israel-Iran conflict, bringing the confrontation ever closer to Israel's borders and amplifying the risk of a regional war. Iran's footprint in Iraq is perhaps the most profound, and most misunderstood. Following the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the subsequent fall of Saddam Hussein, Iran saw an opening of historic proportions. No longer hemmed in by a hostile Sunni dictator, Tehran moved quickly to cultivate influence in the new Iraq, particularly among the Shiite majority. It began backing a constellation of militias and political factions, many of which were forged in the fires of the Iraq-Iran War or trained by the Quds Force during the American occupation. Groups like Kataib Hezbollah, Assaib al-Haq, and the Badr organization became the bedrock of Iran's presence in Iraq. While they fought against ISIS, they also ensured that Iranian influence remained embedded in Iraqi politics, military structures, and society. These militias, operating under the umbrella of the Popular Mobilization Forces, PMF, blurred the lines between legitimate defense forces and Iranian proxies. They were armed, trained, and ideologically shaped by Tehran, and they openly pledged allegiance to Ayatollah Khamenei as their spiritual leader. Israel viewed this development with growing alarm. Iraq, once a distant battlefield, was now a potential launching ground for missile attacks, drone incursions, and covert operations. Iranian weapons shipments began flowing from Tehran through Iraq into Syria and Lebanon, forming what Israeli analysts referred to as the land bridge. This corridor of influence, stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea, allowed Iran to supply Hezbollah and other proxies with increasingly sophisticated weaponry. It also provided strategic continuity, ensuring that, even if one node were cut off, others could maintain the flow of logistics and support. Syria became the critical artery in this chain. When the Syrian civil war erupted in 2011, Iran saw another opportunity. Not just to preserve its longtime ally Bashar al-Assad, but to deepen its entrenchment in the Levant. The war presented Tehran with a dual imperative: protect the Damascus regime and transform Syria into a forward operating base against Israel. The Quds Force deployed thousands of advisors, coordinated tens of thousands of foreign fighters, from Lebanese Hezbollah to Afghan and Pakistani Shia recruits, and invested heavily in military infrastructure. Iran's presence in Syria was expansive. Missile depots were constructed in underground facilities. Intelligence outposts sprouted near the Golan Heights. Drone bases were quietly built in the desert. Iran even began constructing factories capable of producing precision-guided munitions, posing a qualitative threat to Israeli military superiority. For Israel, this redrew the strategic map. Syria was no longer just a chaotic civil war zone, it was a staging ground for Iranian encroachment. In response, Israel launched hundreds of airstrikes, targeting convoys, weapons caches, and command centers. These strikes, though largely unacknowledged in official Israeli statements, were openly discussed in defense circles. The goal was clear: degrade Iran's infrastructure without provoking a full-scale war. But the game was dangerous. Iranian operatives, Hezbollah fighters, and even Russian contractors were often present at these sites. Each strike carried the risk of regional escalation. Or worse, confrontation with Moscow. To the south, in Yemen, Iran's influence took on a different character. There, the Islamic Republic supported the Houthi movement, an insurgency rooted in the Zaydi Shia minority but increasingly aligned with Tehran's geopolitical ambitions. Though the Houthis were not initially Iranian clients, years of war with the Saudi-led coalition drew them closer to Iran. Iranian drones, missiles, and training began flowing into Yemen via smuggling networks and maritime routes. The Houthis, in turn, began to adopt Iran's rhetoric, chanting "Death to America, Death to Israel" at their rallies, and attacking Saudi and Emirati targets with growing precision. For Israel, the Houthis were more than a southern nuisance, they were a potential third front. From Yemeni territory, Iran-backed forces could threaten Israeli maritime traffic in the Red Sea, disrupt global shipping lanes, and even launch long-range missile attacks toward Eilat or the Negev. The possibility of a three-pronged confrontation, Hezbollah in the north, Hamas in the west, Houthis in the south, began to shape Israeli defense planning in unprecedented ways. This multi-pronged strategy was the embodiment of Iran's asymmetric warfare doctrine. Instead of direct confrontation, Tehran relied on a network of partners and proxies, each adapted to its local environment, each equipped with a blend of ideological loyalty and military autonomy. It was a strategy of redundancy and flexibility. If Hezbollah were degraded, Iraqi militias could act. If Hamas were suppressed, the Houthis could strike. If Syria became too dangerous, Lebanon remained an option. The genius, and the danger of this approach lay in its ability to stretch Israel's defenses thin. It created a sense of siege, a feeling that at any moment, from any direction, an attack could erupt. It also complicated deterrence. Iran itself could deny involvement, while its proxies bore the brunt of retaliation. This deniability allowed Tehran to bleed its enemies while avoiding the costs of open war. But Israel, too, was adapting. Its intelligence services mapped out Iran's regional networks in excruciating detail. Mossad operations in Iraq and Syria became increasingly bold. Israeli drones patrolled the Red Sea and monitored Iranian activity in the Gulf. And in the halls of its Ministry of Defense, Israel began planning not for a war against a single country, but for a regional conflict against an entire axis. Iran's expansion into Iraq, Syria, and Yemen was not merely a projection of power, it was a declaration of strategic intent. Tehran was building a buffer against external threats, an archipelago of influence stretching across the Arab world. In doing so, it was not just confronting Israel, it was challenging the very architecture of the post-Cold War Middle East. And with every base built, every proxy armed, and every alliance forged, the prospect of confrontation grew, not as a matter of if, but of when. Chapter 12, Gaza erupts, Hamas, Iran, and the cycles of war. Along the Mediterranean coastline, wedged between Israel and Egypt, lies the Gaza Strip, a narrow, densely populated enclave that has become one of the most explosive flashpoints in the Israel-Iran conflict. Though small in size, Gaza has loomed large in regional geopolitics. It is here, among its twisting alleys and battered buildings, that Iran's reach takes a particularly volatile shape. It is here that Hamas, once a localized movement, has transformed into a key pillar of Tehran's strategy of resistance. And it is here that the cycles of war between Israel and Iranian-backed factions have become regular, devastating, and seemingly endless. Hamas, the Islamist movement that governs Gaza, did not begin as an Iranian ally. Born in 1987 during the First Intifada, Hamas originated from the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, a Sunni organization whose religious ideology differed markedly from the Shiite revolutionary doctrine espoused by Iran. Yet geopolitics, as always, finds strange bedfellows. As Hamas gained power and influence, and as the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank moved closer to diplomacy with Israel, Hamas sought new patrons. Iran, ever eager to support groups opposed to Israel's existence, stepped in. Initially, the relationship was cautious, driven more by mutual interests than shared ideology. Iran began supplying Hamas with money, weapons designs, and training. Tunnels under Gaza's border with Egypt were used to smuggle Iranian-supplied rockets, while Hamas fighters traveled to Lebanon and even Iran to receive military instruction. Over time, this support evolved from episodic assistance into a structured, strategic partnership. Hamas became a full participant in the axis of resistance, coordinating with Hezbollah, Iranian intelligence, and the IRGC's Quds force. This alliance fundamentally changed the military balance in Gaza. In the early 2000s, Hamas's arsenal consisted mostly of crude homemade projectiles. By the 2010s, it possessed thousands of rockets, some capable of reaching Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. The design of many of these rockets bore striking resemblance to Iranian models, and the know-how to produce them indigenously was clearly exported from Tehran and its allies. Gaza became, in effect, an outpost of Iran's southern strategy, a launch pad that could strike at the heart of Israel from a few dozen kilometers away. The eruption of full-scale conflict between Israel and Hamas became increasingly frequent, 2008, 2012, 2014, 2021. Each war bloodier, more complex, and more technologically sophisticated than the last. What began as rocket exchanges soon escalated into drone warfare, cyber sabotage, and targeted assassinations. Israel's Iron Dome, a marvel of missile defense, intercepted thousands of projectiles, but the psychological and economic toll of repeated rocket barrages began to mount. Behind each round of violence, Iran's imprint was increasingly evident. Iranian leaders praised every Hamas escalation as a blow to Zionism. Revolutionary Guard commanders openly declared their support. And while Tehran often denied direct control over Hamas's decisions, the flow of funds, weapons components, and ideological encouragement told another story. Hamas's military wing, the Izz ad-Din al-Qassam brigades, became a hybrid force, part local militia, part foreign proxy. Yet the relationship between Hamas and Iran was not without strain. The outbreak of the Syrian civil war created a serious rift. Hamas, sympathetic to the Sunni opposition against Bashar al-Assad, distanced itself from Damascus. Iran, however, doubled down on its support for Assad. For a time, Iranian funding for Hamas waned, and tensions flared. But strategic necessity proved stronger than sectarian division. As Iran's regional position strengthened and Hamas found itself increasingly isolated diplomatically, the two sides reconciled. This reconciliation became evident in subsequent conflicts. In the 2021 Gaza War, known in Israel as Operation Guardian of the Walls, Hamas unleashed unprecedented rocket barrages. Thousands of missiles were launched in just over a week, some reaching farther than ever before. While Israel responded with overwhelming airstrikes, Iranian officials took to the airwaves, praising Hamas and warning of more support to come. It was clear that the bond had not only healed, it had deepened. For Israel, this presented a nightmarish scenario, a hostile entity governing a territory just a few miles from its heartland, backed by a regional adversary bent on its destruction. The military equation had changed. Hamas was no longer just a Palestinian resistance group, it was an Iranian satellite, armed with increasingly sophisticated tools, and coordinated with Hezbollah and the Quds force. Every flare-up in Gaza risked becoming a multi-front conflict. Moreover, Gaza served a dual purpose for Iran. Militarily, it tied down Israeli forces and exposed vulnerabilities. Politically, it allowed Iran to position itself as the true defender of the Palestinian cause, especially as more Arab states normalized relations with Israel. Tehran seized on this narrative, portraying itself as the only power willing to arm the Palestinians and confront Zionism directly. In Iranian media and public discourse, Gaza became a symbol of righteous struggle. A bleeding wound that could one day help bring down the Israeli state. And yet, the people of Gaza bore the heaviest burden. Each war left behind shattered infrastructure, grieving families, and mounting despair. Schools were turned into shelters. Hospitals operated under siege conditions. International aid poured in, only to be eroded by blockades, internal corruption, and more rounds of destruction. The humanitarian crisis deepened, but the strategic calculus remained unchanged. Israel, for its part, oscillated between deterrence and diplomacy. It sought to weaken Hamas militarily, but avoid full occupation. It tried to facilitate humanitarian aid, but prevent weapons smuggling. It attempted ceasefires, but prepared for the next round. And all the while, the deeper issue remained unresolved: the status of Gaza, the future of Palestinian self-determination, and the looming presence of Iran behind the scenes. In this theater, war had become ritual. Each side knew the choreography, the provocations, the responses, the global outcry, the uneasy ceasefire. But each war also sharpened the weapons, deepened the enmity, and edged the region closer to a broader conflagration. Gaza was not just a battlefield. It was a fuse, short, volatile, and dangerously close to the powder keg of the Israel-Iran rivalry. Chapter 13, Shadow Skies, the Drone Wars begin. In the boundless skies above the deserts of the Middle East, a silent revolution in warfare was taking place. No longer did fleets of fighter jets or battalions of tanks determine supremacy on the battlefield. Instead, the future of conflict was being shaped by unmanned aerial vehicles, drones, silhouetted shadows that could loiter undetected, strike with precision, and vanish into the wind. For Israel and Iran, two nations locked in a sprawling, asymmetric struggle, the rise of drone warfare opened a new dimension in their rivalry, one of intelligence, stealth, and surgical lethality. Iran's embrace of drone technology began in earnest during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, when rudimentary models were used for reconnaissance. But in the decades that followed, under pressure from international sanctions and isolation, Iran transformed necessity into innovation. Lacking access to Western weapons systems, the Islamic Republic began developing its own indigenous drone industry. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, particularly the Aerospace Force, spearheaded these efforts. By the early 2000s, Iran was producing drones capable of surveillance, targeting, and, increasingly, offensive strikes. The Shahed, Mohajer, and Ababil series became mainstays of Iran's drone arsenal. These systems, while not on par with American or Israeli UAVs in sophistication, offered Iran something invaluable: reach. They allowed Tehran to monitor enemies, project power beyond its borders, and, crucially, equip its proxies with effective air capabilities. By the 2010s, Iranian drones had been deployed in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and even the Palestinian territories. They became an affordable, deniable means of surveillance and attack, often deployed in swarms or launched from mobile platforms. For Israel, the growing Iranian drone program represented a serious strategic challenge. While Israel had long been a pioneer in UAV technology, developing advanced drones for both surveillance and combat, it now faced the prospect of drone warfare in its own backyard, orchestrated by a determined adversary. Iranian drones provided Hezbollah with enhanced intelligence capabilities. In Gaza, Hamas began fielding homemade UAVs modeled on Iranian designs. And in Yemen, the Houthis used Iranian-supplied drones to strike Saudi and Emirati targets, threatening to encircle Israel with aerial threats from every direction. The battlefield was evolving. In 2018, Iranian forces in Syria launched a drone into Israeli airspace. The aircraft, shot down by the Israeli Air Force, was later revealed to be carrying explosives. This marked one of the first confirmed attempts by Iran to use drones for a direct attack on Israeli territory. In response, Israel bombed the drone's command center in Syria, igniting a broader exchange of fire. The incident was not just a tactical skirmish. It was a declaration that drone warfare was now part of the operational toolkit in the Israel-Iran conflict. Over time, these encounters grew more frequent and complex. Iran's drones became more capable, some equipped with precision-guided munitions, others designed for kamikaze-style missions. Israel responded with a layered approach. Investing in new drone detection systems, upgrading radar and missile defense platforms, and launching preemptive strikes on drone factories and storage facilities in Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon. One of Israel's key objectives became disrupting the flow of drone components and blueprints to Hezbollah and other proxies. In 2021, Israel launched Operation Guardian of the Walls against Hamas in Gaza. During the conflict, Hamas employed drones for both surveillance and attempted attacks. While most were intercepted or ineffective, their mere presence represented a dangerous evolution. A new aerial front had opened, one in which militias could cheaply and effectively challenge a conventional army with small, maneuverable aircraft, often guided by GPS and loaded with deadly payloads. The drone wars also extended to cyber domains. Israeli and Iranian hackers began targeting drone command systems, seeking to hijack or disrupt UAV operations. There were reports of drone fleets being spoofed, tricked by false GPS signals into crashing or turning on their operators. In this realm, the lines between software and battlefield blurred completely. A drone strike was no longer just a military action, it was a test of electromagnetic warfare, algorithmic deception, and cyber countermeasures. Yet perhaps the most alarming development came not from the skies over Syria or Gaza, but from beyond the region entirely. In 2021 and 2022, Iranian-made drones began appearing in conflicts far afield, most notably in the hands of Russia during its invasion of Ukraine. The Shahid 136, a loitering munition developed by Iran and exported to Moscow, gained global notoriety for its ability to evade radar and strike with devastating impact. These same drones had been tested and refined in Middle Eastern conflicts, including against Israeli-aligned forces. The technology was not just spreading, it was evolving. Israel, deeply aware of the implications, accelerated its drone defense programs. New lasers, electronic warfare systems, and UAV hunting drones were developed. Israeli defense firms, already at the forefront of aerospace innovation, began designing multi-tiered systems capable of defending cities not just from rockets, but from drone swarms. Meanwhile, Iran and its proxies doubled down on drone development, experimenting with AI, swarm capabilities, and longer ranges. Hezbollah unveiled drones with extended flight times. The Houthis used UAVs to hit tankers in the Red Sea. The skies above the Middle East became not just a theater of surveillance, but of constant, invisible tension. In this new era, the asymmetry that defined the Israel-Iran conflict had taken to the skies. No longer could Israel rely solely on conventional military superiority. The battlefield had changed, diffused, decentralized, and airborne. And for both nations, the race was on. Not just to dominate the drone wars, but to redefine the very nature of deterrence and defense in a world where shadows cast by small machines could ignite massive consequences. In the silence of the stratosphere, in the hum of electric wings, a new war had begun, one where the enemy might never be seen, until it was too late. Chapter 14, Cyber Frontlines, Digital Sabotage and Silent Strikes. Beneath the physical battlegrounds of rockets and drones, another war has been raging. One waged not in open deserts or crowded cities, but in the silent realm of code, servers, and algorithms. The Israel-Iran conflict, always multifaceted, has in recent years expanded into cyberspace, evolving into a contest of hackers, digital espionage, and sabotage. This new frontier is not defined by geography or military ranks, but by invisible footprints, zero-day vulnerabilities, and the constant hum of data transfers. It is the cyber war. Quiet, persistent, and potentially more disruptive than any missile ever launched. For Israel, a nation that has long invested heavily in cybersecurity and digital infrastructure, cyber warfare is both a defensive necessity and an offensive weapon. With its world-renowned tech industry, elite military units like Unit 8200, and partnerships with major Western intelligence agencies, Israel has become a global powerhouse in cyber capabilities. Against Iran, it has deployed these assets with remarkable precision, disrupting nuclear development, hacking infrastructure, and foiling plots before they were ever launched. The most famous cyber operation in modern history, and perhaps the most dramatic entry point into this digital Cold War, was the deployment of the Stuxnet virus in the late 2000s. Jointly developed by Israel and the United States, Stuxnet was a sophisticated worm that infiltrated the computer systems of Iran's Natanz nuclear facility. It specifically targeted the centrifuge control software, causing the devices to spin themselves into failure while the systems reported normal operation. The result was catastrophic to Iran's uranium enrichment process, setting the program back years without a single bomb or bullet. What made Stuxnet revolutionary wasn't just its effectiveness, it was the way it redefined warfare. For the first time, a state-sponsored cyber weapon had caused real-world physical destruction. It proved that lines of code, quietly inserted into a network, could accomplish what airstrikes could not: sabotage, stealth, and deniability. It was an opening salvo in what would become a long cyber campaign. Iran, wounded but not deterred, responded by significantly investing in its own cyber capabilities. The IRGC created dedicated cyber units and began recruiting hackers from universities, foreign alliances, and even criminal networks. Within a few years, Iran had transformed into a formidable cyber actor, capable of offensive operations targeting not just Israel but its allies and global interests. Iranian cyber attacks took many forms. Some were blunt force denial of service attacks on Israeli banks and government websites. Others were more refined: phishing campaigns against diplomats, data theft from security agencies, and ransomware attacks on infrastructure. In 2020, Iranian hackers reportedly targeted Israel's water supply systems, attempting to alter chlorine levels in a manner that, if successful, could have endangered civilian lives. Israeli officials publicly acknowledged the attack and responded swiftly, viewing it not merely as sabotage but as an escalation toward cyber terrorism. Israel, in turn, retaliated in kind. A few weeks after the water supply incident, a mysterious disruption occurred at the Shahid Raji port in Iran's Bandar Abbas. The port systems crashed, causing massive delays and logistical paralysis. While Israeli officials remained silent, cyber analysts traced the fingerprints back to Tel Aviv. The message was clear: attacks on civilian infrastructure would not go unanswered, and Israel had the technical reach to strike deep within Iranian territory. These tit-for-tat digital strikes became a new language in the shadow war. In the physical world, escalation carried the risk of retaliation and global condemnation. In cyberspace, however, the rules were murkier. Attribution was difficult, timelines were compressed, and thresholds for response were undefined. It allowed both states to engage in conflict without crossing the lines that might trigger all-out war. But cyber warfare also bled into espionage. Iranian hackers breached private security firms in Israel, exfiltrating surveillance footage and sensitive documents. Israeli operatives reportedly used cyber tools to extract nuclear secrets, monitor weapon shipments, and disrupt financial networks that funneled money to Hezbollah and Hamas. In some cases, these operations were combined with physical interventions, like raids on facilities or assassinations of cyber personnel. Moreover, the cyber war extended beyond state actors. Proxy groups aligned with Iran, such as Lebanon's Hezbollah or Yemen's Houthi movement, began to develop their own digital wings, using Iranian software and expertise. These groups targeted Israeli infrastructure, launched disinformation campaigns on social media, and flooded Israeli servers with traffic in coordinated denial-of-service attacks. Israel, meanwhile, used cyber tools to monitor the communications of these proxies, infiltrate their command structures, and manipulate their planning processes. Cyber operations also began to target civilian morale and economic stability. Iranian groups published databases containing names, addresses, and personal information of Israeli citizens. Some even hacked into dating apps and travel platforms, exposing users or planting disinformation. The goal was clear: to sow distrust in Israel's cyber defenses and erode the sense of safety among its citizens. Israel, in turn, struck back by sabotaging Iranian power grids, hacking oil exports, and disrupting communications during protests inside Iran. Using the digital battlefield to both pressure the regime and support internal dissent. Yet even in this ethereal domain, the risk of escalation loomed large. What if a cyber attack disabled a hospital's power during surgery? What if a ransomware assault grounded planes or derailed trains? What if a malicious virus spread beyond its intended target and wreaked havoc globally, as Stuxnet nearly did? These questions haunted policymakers on both sides. The very tools that provided subtle leverage also risked triggering unintended catastrophes. Despite this, the cyber war became entrenched, an ever-present hum beneath the more visible layers of conflict. It reshaped the strategies of both nations. Iran learned to diversify its networks, isolate critical systems, and develop local software immune to Western backdoors. Israel hardened its defenses, established national cyber command centers, and made cyber education a pillar of military training. In many ways, the cyber front mirrored the broader Israel-Iran conflict, asymmetrical, relentless, and evolving. It was not about conquest, but about control, influence, and disruption. And unlike traditional warfare, where treaties and ceasefires could mark an end, the cyber war had no endpoint, only an endless game of adaptation, innovation, and resilience. Here, in the silent glow of monitors and the coded pulses of digital breath, the struggle continued. Not with fire and smoke, but with silence and light. Chapter 15, The Nuclear Question, Countdown to Confrontation. At the heart of the Israel-Iran conflict lies one issue that eclipses all others in gravity, risk, and existential consequence: Iran's nuclear program. It is the fulcrum on which decades of tension have balanced, the line in the sand that neither side can allow the other to cross. For Israel, the prospect of a nuclear-armed Iran is not a strategic nuisance, it is an intolerable threat to its very survival. For Iran, the pursuit of nuclear capability is a matter of sovereignty, deterrence, and regional stature. This is not simply a contest over weapons. It is a countdown, measured in uranium enrichment levels, covert sites, and the narrowing margins of diplomacy and time. Iran's nuclear ambitions trace back to the era of the Shah, when the United States itself encouraged Tehran to develop a civilian nuclear program as part of its Atoms for Peace initiative. But after the 1979 Islamic Revolution, relations with the West collapsed, and Iran's nuclear efforts took on a darker hue. Western suspicions mounted as intelligence agencies began to uncover hidden facilities, secret purchases of centrifuge components, and unexplained stockpiles of uranium. In the early 2000s, revelations about nuclear sites at Natanz and Iraq triggered an international crisis. Iran claimed it was pursuing peaceful nuclear energy under the rights guaranteed by the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But the evidence suggested otherwise. A covert program, operating in parallel with known facilities, aimed at building the capability to enrich uranium to weapons-grade levels. Israel viewed these developments with increasing alarm. It had long maintained a policy of strategic ambiguity regarding its own nuclear arsenal, widely believed to be the most advanced in the region. But the notion of a rival, ideologically hostile theocracy possessing similar weapons was anathema. Israeli leaders, from Ariel Sharon to Benjamin Netanyahu, made it clear, Iran would not be allowed to develop nuclear weapons. Not under any circumstances. This red line set the stage for an intense and complex international confrontation. While the US and European powers sought to negotiate, Israel began preparing for unilateral action. Israeli intelligence, particularly Mossad, launched a series of bold covert operations aimed at sabotaging Iran's progress. From the Stuxnet virus that destroyed centrifuges, to assassinations of nuclear scientists, to theft of nuclear archives from deep within Tehran, Israel engaged in what can only be described as a slow-motion war to stop the bomb before it was ever built. In 2015, after years of painstaking diplomacy, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, was signed between Iran and 6 world powers. The deal required Iran to significantly limit its enrichment capabilities, reduce its uranium stockpile, and allow comprehensive inspections in exchange for sanctions relief. It was hailed by many as a triumph of diplomacy. Iran, for its part, accepted deep restrictions and poured concrete into its Iraq reactor core, symbolizing a commitment to rollback. But in Israel, the response was one of intense opposition. Prime Minister Netanyahu publicly condemned the deal, famously addressing the U.S. Congress in 2015 to warn that it paved the way to an Iranian bomb under the guise of peace. He argued that the sunset clauses embedded in the agreement would eventually allow Iran to resume enrichment activities legally, with international blessing. To Israel, the JCPOA was a pause button, not a solution. In 2018, the Trump administration withdrew the United States from the JCPOA and reimposed heavy sanctions on Iran in a campaign of maximum pressure. The collapse of the deal unleashed a new and perilous phase. Iran, angry at the breach and starved economically, began to resume enrichment. By 2021, it had crossed the 60% enrichment threshold, dangerously close to weapons-grade uranium. It installed advanced centrifuges, limited international inspections, and accelerated research and development in direct defiance of the international community. For Israel, the alarm bells could not ring louder. Israeli defense chief spoke openly of preparing military options. The Israeli Air Force intensified long-range bombing drills, simulating strikes on Iranian facilities buried deep underground. Reports surfaced of bunker-busting munitions being procured, of refueling aircraft being readied for extended sorties, and of coordination with Gulf partners for potential overflight corridors. Yet a direct strike on Iran's nuclear facilities would be fraught with peril. Iran had dispersed its program, hardened its sites, and embedded its infrastructure near civilian populations. A strike would not only require immense precision, it could ignite a regional war. Iran would retaliate via its proxies, Hezbollah's rockets in the north, Hamas's barrages from Gaza, Houthi missiles from Yemen, and potentially attacks on Israeli embassies and Jewish targets worldwide. The specter of all-out war, with nuclear stakes looming, would no longer be hypothetical. Still, Israel remained undeterred. If the world doesn't act, Netanyahu declared, we will. The Israeli security establishment knew that the cost of action could be high, but the cost of inaction, they believed, could be annihilation. Never again, the doctrine born from the ashes of the Holocaust, underpinned every calculation. Iran, on the other hand, has always denied seeking nuclear weapons. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei issued a fatwa declaring the development of such weapons un-Islamic. But the opacity of the program, the existence of weapons design documents, and the scale of enrichment suggested that Iran was positioning itself for a nuclear breakout, ready to sprint toward a bomb if and when the political calculus demanded it. International efforts to revive the JCPOA have sputtered. Distrust runs deep on all sides. The window for diplomacy narrows with each passing month, while Iran inches closer to a threshold capability. For Israel, this moment is not just a policy dilemma, it is a countdown. In the corridors of power in Tel Aviv and Tehran, in the halls of Vienna and Geneva, and in the war rooms of the world's capitals, the question hangs in the air: will Iran cross the nuclear threshold? And if it does, what will Israel do? This is the point at which history converges with destiny. One wrong move, one miscalculation, one act too late, and the long shadow of nuclear war could fall over the Middle East. Chapter 16, Regional Fallout, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and the Expanding Web. The conflict between Israel and Iran, though often cast as a two-player drama, has long rippled far beyond their borders, pulling other regional powers into its orbit. Among these, Saudi Arabia and Turkey have emerged as critical actors, each with its own ambitions, anxieties, and strategies. As Tehran and Jerusalem sharpened their rivalry, Riyadh and Ankara found themselves both participants in, and manipulators of, the unfolding tension. The result is a complex web of alignments, proxy dynamics, and diplomatic recalibrations that continue to reshape the Middle East's geopolitical map. For Saudi Arabia, Iran's rise has long been an existential concern. As the leader of the Sunni Arab world and custodian of Islam's two holiest sites, Riyadh sees itself as the rightful regional hegemon. Iran, a revolutionary Shiite power with a parallel claim to Islamic leadership, is viewed not merely as a rival but as a subversive threat to the monarchy's legitimacy. The two powers have clashed by proxy in Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, Bahrain, and most dramatically in Yemen, where the Iranian-backed Houthi insurgency has fired missiles into the Saudi heartland and threatened vital oil infrastructure. Yet Saudi Arabia's position on Israel has been far more complicated. Officially, Riyadh has not normalized ties with the Jewish state. The kingdom continues to express rhetorical support for Palestinian statehood and maintains a public posture of hostility toward Israeli policy. But behind closed doors, the dynamics have shifted dramatically. Shared fears of Iranian expansionism, coupled with a pragmatic vision for economic modernization under Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's Vision 2030 plan, have brought the Saudis and Israelis into a quiet but profound alignment. Intelligence cooperation between the two countries, once unthinkable, is now a guarded norm. Israeli technology has reportedly made its way into Saudi cybersecurity systems. Strategic dialogue has occurred through American intermediaries and Gulf partners like the UAE and Bahrain. Riyadh's airspace has opened to Israeli commercial flights, an unspoken gesture of détente. Most crucially, both nations see a nuclear-armed Iran as a red line. While Israel threatens preemptive military action, Saudi Arabia warns it will pursue its own nuclear program if Iran achieves breakout capability. The two rivals, one Jewish and one Sunni Muslim, have found themselves on parallel tracks in opposition to Tehran's ambitions. Turkey, on the other hand, occupies a more ambiguous and at times contradictory role. Under President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Turkey has pursued a neo-Ottoman foreign policy, assertive, independent, and regionally expansive. Erdogan has been a vocal critic of Israel, especially over its treatment of Palestinians. He has positioned himself as a champion of Muslim causes, hosting Hamas leaders in Ankara and challenging Israeli actions in Gaza and Jerusalem with fiery rhetoric. At the same time, Turkey and Israel have maintained substantial trade relations and, in recent years, have sought to restore full diplomatic ties after years of acrimony. With regard to Iran, Turkey's posture has vacillated. On one hand, Ankara and Tehran share economic interests and energy ties. On the other, they are fierce competitors in Syria, Iraq, and the Caucasus. Turkey has opposed Iranian influence over Kurdish factions and has conducted military operations to counter both PKK insurgents and Iranian-backed militias. In Syria, Turkey supports opposition forces, while Iran backs the Assad regime, placing the two on opposite sides of a brutal conflict. Yet despite these tensions, Turkey has also served as a mediator. It hosted nuclear negotiations, sought to de-escalate crises, and at times positioned itself as a bridge between Tehran and the West. This diplomatic agility allows Ankara to play both sides, leveraging its ties to Tehran and Jerusalem as needed to assert its regional weight. In doing so, Turkey has complicated the Israel-Iran equation, not as a proxy or pawn, but as a self-interested actor with its own imperial vision. Other regional players have also been drawn into the widening gyre. The United Arab Emirates, once quietly aligned with Israel, has now publicly embraced the relationship through the Abraham Accords. Bahrain, similarly, sees Iran as a direct threat to its Sunni monarchy, which governs a Shiite majority population. Egypt, though maintaining peace with Israel, carefully watches Iranian movements in the Red Sea and Sinai. Jordan, ever wary of regional instability, plays the role of cautious ally to Israel while managing its own tensions with Iran-aligned groups in Syria. In this crowded arena, the Israel-Iran conflict is no longer just bilateral, it is a regional framework within which alliances are tested, interests recalibrated, and power redistributed. Each state's actions are not made in isolation but in anticipation of how the others will respond. A strike in Damascus might ripple to Riyadh. A cyber attack in Tel Aviv might provoke fallout in Manama. The web is interlinked, the stakes shared. The United States, though geographically distant, remains a pivotal node in this network. It backs Israel unconditionally, sells arms to the Saudis, engages with Turkey through NATO, and negotiates with Iran through intermediaries. But as American focus shifts toward Asia, regional powers are increasingly left to manage their own security dilemmas, leading to new configurations of cooperation, confrontation, and realpolitik. And in the shadows, Iran watches. It sees the normalization of Israel's relationships with its Arab neighbors not as a diplomatic evolution but as strategic encirclement. It sees Turkey's maneuvers as opportunism. It sees Saudi Arabia's quiet partnership with Israel as betrayal. This perception of siege only deepens Iran's commitment to asymmetric warfare, proxy development, and deterrence through missile and nuclear capabilities. The regional fallout is not just a consequence of the Israel-Iran conflict, it is now its context. Every state in the Middle East is touched by this struggle, directly or indirectly. And as the web grows more intricate, the danger increases. That a localized skirmish could spiral into a multinational conflagration, drawn together by invisible threads of allegiance and animosity. The Middle East has always been a place where local conflicts become global concerns. And in the long shadow cast by Iran and Israel, even distant players can find themselves suddenly, dangerously, entangled. Chapter 17, Espionage and Assassinations, The Hidden War. In the twilight world of intelligence, where shadows conceal truths and silence delivers the loudest blows, the conflict between Israel and Iran has found one of its most dangerous and defining arenas. Away from the missile silos and political podiums, far from the TV cameras and UN chambers, a clandestine war has raged for decades, a war waged not by armies, but by agents. Espionage and assassination have become silent pillars of the Israel-Iran rivalry, shaping its trajectory as profoundly as any overt strike. For Israel, whose survival has often depended on the precision and boldness of its intelligence services, this hidden war has long been a matter of national doctrine. The Mossad, Israel's foreign intelligence agency, is not only feared but globally respected for its effectiveness and daring. Its unofficial motto, by way of deception, "Thou shalt do war," is more than a slogan, it's a strategic philosophy. Against Iran, Mossad has deployed every tool in its arsenal: surveillance, infiltration, sabotage, and most dramatically, targeted killings. One of the earliest and most notable fronts of this shadow war began in the 1980s and 1990s, when Israel began tracking Iranian funding and coordination with Hezbollah. Following the devastating 1992 bombing of the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires and the 1994 attack on a Jewish community center, both attributed to Hezbollah with Iranian support, Mossad intensified its operations against Iran's overseas networks. Agents were dispatched to monitor Iranian diplomats, infiltrate cultural centers, and disrupt financial transactions linked to Tehran's proxy warfare. But it was in the 2000s, as Iran's nuclear program accelerated, that Israel's covert campaign truly escalated. A series of mysterious deaths began to plague Iranian nuclear scientists. In what appeared to be a coordinated campaign, 5 key figures involved in uranium enrichment and warhead design were killed between 2010 and 2012. One was blown up by a magnetic bomb attached to his car in broad daylight in Tehran, another was shot by motorcyclists in rush-hour traffic. Though Israel never officially claimed responsibility, the operations bore all the hallmarks of Mossad's signature style: precision, deniability, and strategic timing. The intent was clear. Israel sought to slow Iran's nuclear progress not just through sanctions or diplomacy, but by removing the minds behind the machines. These assassinations, surgical in execution, sent a message not only to Iran but to the world: Israel would do whatever it took to stop the bomb, quietly, effectively, and without apology. Iran, in turn, did not sit idle. Its own intelligence apparatus, particularly the Ministry of Intelligence and Security, MOS, and the IRGC's intelligence organization, ramped up their global operations. Iranian agents plotted attacks against Israeli targets worldwide, including embassies, diplomats, and Jewish institutions. Some plots were foiled, others came dangerously close to success. In Azerbaijan, Cyprus, Georgia, Thailand, cities thousands of miles from Tehran or Tel Aviv, Iranian networks operated in the shadows, looking to strike back. At home, Iran also began a chilling campaign of its own, targeting dissidents, defectors, and double agents. Scientists who cooperated with Western intelligence vanished. Former regime insiders who fled abroad found themselves hunted. Cyber surveillance became ubiquitous. Tehran was determined to plug the holes through which Israeli operatives had seeped, and to punish betrayal with ruthless efficiency. The battle also extended to espionage operations of extraordinary boldness. In 2018, Prime Minister Netanyahu stunned the world when he revealed that Mossad agents had infiltrated a secure warehouse in Tehran and stolen half a ton of secret nuclear documents. The mission, carried out over a single night, involved penetrating deep into Iranian territory, breaching a heavily guarded facility, extracting vast quantities of intelligence, and exfiltrating the materials back to Israel, all without triggering alarms or casualties. It was an operation of cinematic proportions, and a psychological earthquake within Iran's security establishment. These revelations provided concrete evidence that Iran had pursued nuclear weapons design long after it claimed otherwise, and that it had meticulously archived that knowledge for future use. For Israel, it was not just an intelligence coup, it was a vindication of its warnings and a dramatic escalation of the psychological dimension of the conflict. In the years that followed, this hidden war continued to evolve. In 2020, the assassination of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, the father of Iran's nuclear program, marked a turning point. Killed in a highly sophisticated ambush outside Tehran, reportedly involving remote-controlled weapons and artificial intelligence, the operation stunned the Iranian regime. Fakhrizadeh had been under tight security for years, and his death was both a technical and symbolic blow. Iranian officials blamed Israel immediately, vowing revenge. The world watched anxiously, fearing the death of one scientist might ignite a wider war. The level of complexity and risk involved in these missions revealed the extraordinary depth of Israeli intelligence penetration into Iranian territory. Whether through human assets, electronic surveillance, or cyber intrusions, Israel had managed to infiltrate one of the world's most tightly controlled police states. Iranian officials, paranoid and increasingly insular, purged their ranks, reshuffled their security forces, and instituted draconian counterintelligence measures. But the damage was done, a sense of vulnerability had seeped into the regime's core. Yet these operations, while effective, came with enormous risks. Each assassination carried the potential to trigger a retaliatory chain reaction. Each act of espionage threatened to provoke wider escalation. And while Mossad's operatives operated with surgical skill, the political consequences of their actions were less predictable. A misstep could lead to diplomatic fallout, or worse, drag the region into open war. Still, the calculus remained unchanged for both sides. Iran continued to fortify its defenses and advance its strategic projects in secrecy. Israel continued to monitor, disrupt, and, when necessary, eliminate. In this theater, there were no declarations of war, no parades or battlefield maps, only obituaries, missing files, and sudden explosions. Espionage and assassination had become not just tools of policy, but pillars of strategy. And as long as the core tensions remained unresolved, over ideology, existence, and nuclear capability, the hidden war would go on. In Tehran and Tel Aviv, in Istanbul, Baku, Dubai, and beyond, the shadows would continue to move. Seen only in the aftermath, felt only when the silence broke. Chapter 18, The Abraham Accords, Normalization and the Iranian Response. In the summer of 2020, a diplomatic thunderclap rolled across the Middle East. After decades of isolation, covert meetings, and unofficial dealings, Israel and several Arab nations stepped into the open and shook hands. The Abraham Accords, brokered by the United States, marked a watershed moment in regional geopolitics. The United Arab Emirates and Bahrain normalized relations with Israel, later joined by Sudan and Morocco. What once would have seemed impossible, the formal recognition of Israel by Arab states without a resolution to the Palestinian question, had suddenly become reality. To Israel, the accords represented a triumphant validation. For years, it had maintained that peace with the Arab world need not be held hostage to the intractable Palestinian conflict. The accords proved this point. More than just peace treaties, they were comprehensive agreements that included trade, technology, tourism, energy cooperation, and even defense partnerships. Israeli delegations flew to Abu Dhabi. Emirati ministers visited Jerusalem. Direct flights launched between Tel Aviv and Manama. The once shadowy diplomacy of the Gulf had stepped into the light. But behind the jubilant headlines and glowing White House ceremonies, a deeper, more strategic undercurrent pulsed, the shared fear of Iran. The Abraham Accords were not born solely of idealism or economic synergy. They were forged in the crucible of regional anxiety, particularly the growing threat posed by Iran's regional ambitions, proxy networks, and nuclear program. The UAE and Bahrain, both Sunni monarchies, had long viewed Iran with suspicion and alarm. Tehran's support for Shiite militias, its interference in Gulf politics, and its military entrenchment in Syria and Iraq had unsettled them for years. The accords with Israel were, in essence, a geopolitical insurance policy, a pivot toward a regional power that could offer both intelligence cooperation and military deterrence. For Iran, the accords were nothing short of a betrayal. They upended decades of Arab consensus around the Palestinian cause and shattered Tehran's narrative of Israel as a regionally isolated pariah. The Iranian leadership reacted with fury. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei condemned the Arab states that signed the agreements, branding them traitors to Islam and accusing them of selling their souls to Zionism and Western imperialism. But the rage went deeper than rhetoric. The Abraham Accords represented a strategic encirclement. Iran suddenly faced the prospect of Israeli intelligence and surveillance capabilities being stationed closer to its borders than ever before. Not just in the north via Azerbaijan or the west via Syria, but now potentially in the Persian Gulf, right across the water. Israeli technology, drone systems, cyber tools, and missile defense systems could soon be embedded in Gulf nations within striking distance of Iranian infrastructure. Iran's response unfolded along multiple tracks. Diplomatically, Tehran sought to deepen its ties with non-signatory Arab states, particularly Iraq, Qatar, and Oman, painting the accords as destabilizing provocations. It portrayed itself as the true defender of the Palestinian cause, seeking to capitalize on Arab discontent and popular protests against normalization. Iranian media blasted the UAE and Bahrain as puppets of Washington and Tel Aviv. Militarily, Iran took steps to increase its defensive readiness. It launched naval exercises in the Strait of Hormuz, deployed additional missile systems to its southern coastline, and issued thinly veiled threats against Emirati and Bahraini infrastructure. Iranian-backed cyber units began probing Gulf networks for vulnerabilities. Tehran wanted to make clear, normalization came with risks, and those who allied with Israel would not be beyond the reach of retaliation. Tehran also leaned harder on its proxies. In Yemen, the Houthis stepped up attacks on Saudi and Emirati targets, including oil facilities and airports. In Iraq, Iranian-backed militias harassed U.S. and coalition forces, signaling Iran's capacity for regional disruption. Hezbollah issued warnings of a coming regional conflict. The message was clear: the Abraham Accords were not a peace dividend, they were a battle cry. For Israel, the Accords opened a new strategic horizon. Access to Gulf airspace significantly shortened the flight path to Iran, bolstering the feasibility of long-range operations. Intelligence sharing with the UAE and Bahrain added new dimensions to its surveillance of Iranian maritime movements, cyber activity, and financial networks. Joint military exercises with the Gulf states, including naval drills in the Red Sea, sent a clear signal of shifting alliances. Moreover, Israel used the momentum to pursue deeper ties with other regional players. Quiet coordination with Saudi Arabia, already underway, accelerated. Though the kingdom did not formally sign the accords, the trajectory was unmistakable. Israeli defense firms participated in international expos in the Gulf. Israeli and Saudi officials met in third countries. For Iran, this was the nightmare scenario: the Jewish state not merely accepted, but welcomed into the very heart of the Arab world. Yet the Abraham Accords also carried internal contradictions. Public sentiment in many Arab nations remained strongly pro-Palestinian. Normalization was a top-down process, driven by monarchs and presidents, not by grassroots movements. Iran sought to exploit this divide, supporting media campaigns, sponsoring protests, and encouraging clerical opposition to the accords across the Arab world. Tehran aimed to delegitimize the agreements not only with force, but with narrative. In the broader strategic picture, the accords represented a tectonic shift in the region's security architecture. They realigned traditional rivalries, redrew diplomatic fault lines, and created a coalition of states with shared concerns over Iran. What had once been a two-front contest, Israel in the west, Iran in the east, was now a regional chessboard with new pieces and new alliances. And in this new order, the stakes had risen. For every Emirati drone deal with Israel, Iran would respond with another missile unveiled in Tehran. For every joint cyber initiative between Manama and Tel Aviv, Iranian hackers would scour for vulnerabilities. The shadow war was no longer just in Lebanon or Syria, it was now in Abu Dhabi, in Casablanca, in Khartoum. The battlefield had expanded. The Abraham Accords were, on the surface, about peace. But in the deeper strategic calculus, they were a reconfiguration of war, a prelude to new forms of containment, confrontation, and, perhaps, collision. Chapter 19, The Shadow of the IRGC, Strategy, Proxies, and Power Projection. Among the most defining forces behind Iran's regional posture, and its enduring conflict with Israel, is a single, powerful institution, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC. More than a military body, the IRGC is a sprawling, ideologically driven state within a state, possessing its own armed forces, intelligence networks, economic empires, and foreign policy agenda. Founded in the turbulent aftermath of the 1979 Islamic Revolution, the IRGC has grown to become not only the vanguard of the revolution but also the architect of Iran's projection of power across the Middle East. And nowhere has its influence been more consequential, or more ominous. then in the long war with Israel. The IRGC was created by Ayatollah Khomeini as a bulwark against internal dissent and external threats to the Islamic Republic. Its mandate was not limited to defending borders, it was tasked with defending the revolution itself. Over time, it evolved into a parallel power structure, eclipsing the regular army in prestige, resources, and strategic importance. Its elite Quds force, commanded for 2 decades by the charismatic and lethal Qasem Soleimani, became the tip of the spear in Iran's foreign operations. It was the Quds force that shaped Iran's asymmetric warfare doctrine, built around a network of loyal, well-armed, and strategically positioned proxies. For Israel, the IRGC's rise was more than a distant concern, it was a direct and growing threat. Through the Quds force, Iran extended its reach into Israel's immediate vicinity. In Lebanon, Hezbollah became the crown jewel of the IRGC's proxy strategy. Founded in the 1980s with Iranian training and funding, Hezbollah grew into a state within a state, boasting tens of thousands of rockets and a paramilitary force more powerful than the Lebanese army. The group waged war against Israel in 2006 and has remained a persistent menace on its northern border ever since, its arsenal growing ever deadlier with Iranian precision-guided munitions. In Gaza, the IRGC forged ties with Hamas and Islamic Jihad, providing them with weapons designs, rocket components, and ideological backing. These groups, though Sunni, found common cause with Tehran in their shared hatred for Israel. The IRGC provided technical assistance for domestic weapons production, transforming Gaza's factions from stonethrowers into missile-launching combatants capable of challenging Israeli defenses. Each conflict, whether in 2008, 2014, or 2021, bore the fingerprints of IRGC influence, whether through tactics, weaponry, or funding pipelines. Beyond Israel's borders, the IRGC spread its influence like a slow but relentless tide. In Iraq, it armed and trained Shiite militias under the banner of the Popular Mobilization Forces, embedding itself in the political and military fabric of the post-Saddam state. In Syria, it helped rescue Bashar al-Assad's regime, deploying troops, commanding militias, and building military infrastructure that brought Iran's presence directly into the Levant. IRGC officers were killed in Israeli airstrikes on Syrian soil, further deepening the undeclared war between the two countries. In Yemen, the IRGC backed the Houthi movement, transforming it from a tribal insurgency into a missile-equipped rebel army. The Houthis, in turn, threatened Israeli interests in the Red Sea, claimed attacks on Israeli shipping, and launched symbolic but strategically significant long-range missile and drone strikes. In Bahrain, Afghanistan, and even parts of Africa and South America, the IRGC cultivated sleeper cells, logistics networks, and influence channels, all in service of Iran's broader confrontation with the West, and with Israel in particular. What made the IRGC especially dangerous in Israeli eyes was not just its reach, but its method. It blurred the lines between state and non-state, between war and peace, between soldier and insurgent. The IRGC fought with militias, not flags. It deployed cyber attacks instead of tanks. It moved weapons through civilian ports, launched drones from unmarked warehouses, and financed its operations through front companies, black markets, and vast business empires stretching from Tehran's bazaar to the heart of Venezuela. In response, Israel developed a doctrine of preemptive disruption. Its air force regularly targeted IRGC positions in Syria. Mossad hunted down IRGC operatives across the globe. Israeli cyber units worked to sabotage IRGC infrastructure, from missile guidance systems to encrypted communications. Each move by the IRGC was countered by a shadow maneuver from Tel Aviv, in a silent dance of escalation and restraint. Yet the IRGC, far from retreating, seemed to thrive in this gray zone warfare. It framed its actions as resistance, its losses as martyrdom, and its aggression as a moral crusade. With the assassination of Qasem Soleimani in a 2020 U.S. drone strike near Baghdad airport, Iran lost its most celebrated military strategist, but not its direction. His successor, Ismail Khani, continued to expand the network Soleimani had built, albeit with less charisma and visibility. The IRGC's economic power also shielded it from accountability. Through vast conglomerates like Khatam al-Anbiya, it controlled major construction, oil, and telecom industries inside Iran. This allowed it to fund its operations independently of the civilian government, operating with autonomy and often in defiance of the elected political leadership. To Israeli analysts, this made the IRGC not just a threat, but a state within a state, untethered from diplomacy and immune to economic leverage. Inside Iran, the IRGC policed political dissent, surveilled dissidents, and ensured regime survival. Outside Iran, it directed a sophisticated, transnational campaign of asymmetric warfare. For Israel, confronting the IRGC meant confronting not just Iran's military, but the core ideological engine of its revolutionary mission. Every rocket fired by Hezbollah, every drone launched from Syria, every cyber breach traced to Tehran, these were not isolated provocations. They were the work of a singular, coordinated vision, that of the IRGC. As the region continues to evolve, with normalization agreements reshaping alliances and nuclear deadlines looming, the IRGC remains the most unpredictable and destabilizing variable. It is the spear, the shield, and the shadow of Iran's strategy. And for Israel, as long as the IRGC operates unchecked, the threat will never be distant. Because the IRGC does not wait for wars to be declared, it wages them silently, perpetually, and without borders. Chapter 20: The Road Ahead, Deterrence, Diplomacy, or Collision. As the long and tangled history of the Israel-Iran conflict stretches into the present, the future looms with profound uncertainty. Decades of open hostility, proxy wars, covert operations, and ideological opposition have forged a rivalry that now feels entrenched, almost structural. Yet in this fraught and shifting landscape, one question towers above all others: what comes next? Will the region find a path to sustainable deterrence? Can diplomacy overcome the weight of history? Or are the two adversaries headed inexorably toward a catastrophic collision? The current state of affairs is a paradox of intensity and restraint. On one hand, Israel and Iran are locked in an ongoing Cold War that periodically flares into direct and deadly violence, whether through airstrikes in Syria, assassinations in Tehran, cyber attacks, or proxy clashes in Gaza and Lebanon. On the other hand, both nations have also demonstrated a consistent, if fragile, ability to avoid full-scale confrontation. Each understands the enormous cost of escalation, especially in a region already teetering under the strain of instability, sectarian divides, and great power competition. For Israel, the strategy moving forward continues to revolve around deterrence through superiority. Its defense doctrine, shaped by geographic vulnerability and historical trauma, is one of proactive containment. Israeli airstrikes in Syria, cyber sabotage of Iran's nuclear infrastructure, and public displays of military readiness are all calibrated to maintain a strategic edge. Israel is also investing heavily in missile defense, systems like Iron Dome, David's Sling, and Arrow 3, meant to shield its cities from the ever-growing rocket arsenals of Hezbollah and Iran's regional proxies. Yet deterrence has its limits. The nuclear question remains unresolved and perilously close to the point of no return. Iran's uranium enrichment continues, edging closer to weapons grade. Its cooperation with international inspectors has diminished. The 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, lies in diplomatic limbo, and efforts to revive it have faltered. Israeli officials have repeatedly warned that they will not tolerate a nuclear-armed Iran, and the language has shifted from possibility to preparation. Tehran, for its part, has responded with a strategy of strategic ambiguity and layered deterrence. It denies that it seeks nuclear weapons, but insists on its right to develop advanced nuclear technology. It has built a vast network of regional allies and proxy forces capable of retaliating against Israel through multiple channels. Its doctrine is based on survival through dispersion, ensuring that even if one node is attacked, others can strike back. Iran's leaders believe that creating a sense of inevitable retaliation is the only way to neutralize Israel's overwhelming technological and military advantages. Yet Iran also faces deep internal and external pressures. Economic sanctions have crippled its economy. Domestic dissent has grown, fueled by youth unrest, women's rights movements, and economic hardship. The regime, increasingly reliant on the IRGC, faces a crisis of legitimacy. And while its regional allies offer strategic depth, they also draw Iran into conflicts that drain resources and inflame tensions. In this environment, Tehran must constantly balance its revolutionary ambitions with the pragmatism required for regime survival. The United States, long the external anchor of Israel's security and the chief architect of the international response to Iran, remains an essential but uncertain player. American policy has swung dramatically in recent years, from the Obama administration's pursuit of engagement, to Trump's maximum pressure campaign, to Biden's attempts at diplomatic re-engagement. Each shift sends ripples across the Middle East, reshaping calculations in both Jerusalem and Tehran. As Washington increasingly pivots toward Asia and domestic priorities, questions linger about the future depth of its commitment to Middle Eastern security. Meanwhile, other regional actors are no longer passive observers. The Abraham Accords have realigned alliances, creating a bloc of Sunni Arab states that view Israel as a partner rather than a foe. Saudi Arabia, while not yet formally normalized with Israel, is inching toward a geopolitical détente rooted in mutual suspicion of Iran. Turkey, Egypt, Jordan, and others weigh their positions with care, understanding that any escalation between Israel and Iran would inevitably spill across borders. And the global context is shifting too. Russia, deeply entangled in Syria alongside Iranian forces, has its own stake in preventing Israeli-Iranian escalation. China, increasingly active in Middle Eastern diplomacy, may seek to broker dialogue or leverage economic ties for influence. Europe, while often sidelined, continues to champion diplomatic engagement. The Middle East is no longer a unipolar chessboard, it is a complex, multiplayer game where missteps are more likely, and unintended consequences more dangerous. So, what are the possible futures? One is managed confrontation, a continuation of the current model: airstrikes, sabotage, proxy skirmishes, and cyber attacks, all carefully calibrated to avoid tipping into open war. This model is sustainable only as long as restraint holds, and intelligence assessments remain accurate. It's a high-wire act with little margin for error. Another possibility is diplomatic reset, a renewed nuclear agreement, possibly broader in scope, that limits Iran's capabilities in exchange for real economic relief and a path to regional integration. Such a deal would require immense political courage, compromise, and sustained international pressure. It may be improbable, but it is not impossible. The third, and most ominous, path is open conflict. A preemptive Israeli strike on Iranian nuclear facilities, either alone or with U.S. support, could spark a regional war. Iran's proxies would almost certainly retaliate. Hezbollah's rockets could rain down on northern Israel. Houthis might strike Gulf oil infrastructure. Global shipping lanes, energy markets, and diaspora communities would be affected. Such a war could be short and brutal, or long and destabilizing. In either case, the toll would be immense. Yet within this dark mosaic, there remains a glimmer of agency. History is not destiny. The very fact that Israel and Iran have managed to avoid direct war for over 4 decades, despite profound antagonism and repeated provocations, suggests a deep mutual awareness of the stakes. Both sides are rational actors operating under intense ideological pressures, but they are not blind. They calculate. They adapt. The road ahead is narrow, but it is not closed. The Israel-Iran conflict is not just a story of enmity. It is also a mirror, reflecting the hopes, fears, and struggles of a region in flux. It tells us about the danger of unresolved histories, the fragility of peace, and the resilience of nations determined to define their own futures. The next chapter is not yet written. But the pen, as always, is in the hands of those bold enough to choose dialogue over destruction, and wise enough to know the cost of failing to do so.